Hey there, and welcome back. It is good to have you here again at the close of the day, with the lamp turned low and the world outside finally beginning to go quiet. This is one of those evenings that asks nothing of you at all, an evening made for setting things down, for letting the day and all its small weights slide gently away from you until your shoulders come loose and your breathing slows. If you have come here tired or restless, or simply ready to be somewhere other than where you are, then you have come to exactly the right place. Tonight, I am going to take you a very long way from wherever you are lying, back across more than 600 years into the candle-lit realm of one of the greatest families in medieval England, and into the short and remarkable life of a single young woman at the very heart of it. You do not need to hold on to any of the names or follow every turning. You can simply let the story carry you, the way a slow river carries a leaf, down and down towards sleep, because the woman we are going to meet tonight was the wife of one king and the mother of another. And yet she herself was never a queen, not for a single day. She would die young in a room she never imagined would be her last, with the towering future of her house still hidden from her, never knowing what her children would become, never knowing that the crown was coming. And by the end of our hours together, we will stand at the spot where they laid her, the grave of a woman who shaped a century and was then very nearly forgotten by it. Before we set out, let me say one quiet thing, and then I promise I will not break the spell again until the very end. If you find, as these hours unfold, that these slow journeys into the past are the kind of company you would like to keep more often, then you are very welcome to stay close and to follow along, so that the next of these evenings can find its way to you when it comes. It costs you nothing, and it means a great deal to me that you are here. And I always love to know who is out there in the dark with me, and where in the age you happen to be lying as my voice reaches you, and what the hour is in your part of the world tonight. Whether it is late evening where you are, or the very small hours, or somewhere quiet in between. If you feel moved to leave a word about it, I do look through them, and I find a strange and lovely comfort in the thought of all these different rooms and cities and countries scattered right throughout her age, drawn together for a while by one old story, but that is all I will ask of you. From here on, there is only the story and the dark and the slow road back into another time. Picture this. A mighty castle of grey stone, standing on rising ground in the green country of the Welsh Marches. In the last decades of the 14th century, with the light of a late afternoon laying long shadows across its walls. Smoke rises from the kitchens and drifts away on the wind. Down in the valley below, the ordinary work of the world goes on as it has for 1,000 years, the ploughs in the fields, the cattle coming home, the river sliding by under the willows. And within those high walls lives a family so rich and so old and so closely bound to the throne of England that to be born into it was to be born among the very greatest people in the land. This is the age we are entering tonight, the world of the high medieval nobility, a realm of vast inheritances and arranged marriages, of crusades and pilgrimages, of illuminated prayer books and long winter evenings by the fire, of children born into more wealth and more danger than we can easily imagine. And somewhere in that age, in a nursery in one of those noble houses, there is a small girl who does not yet know that she is one of the 2 richest children in all of England. Her name is Mary de Bohun, and her story is where we are going to spend this quiet evening together. Let us begin, as all such stories must, with where she came from, because to understand Mary, you must first understand the extraordinary family whose blood she carried. The Bohuns were among the oldest and the proudest of all the noble houses of England, and their roots ran back almost to the very beginning of Norman rule. They had come over from Normandy with William the Conqueror himself, more than 300 years before Mary's birth, one of those families of hard-fighting knights who had crossed the narrow sea and helped to seize a kingdom. The story told of the first of them was that he was a kinsman of the Conqueror, and that he fought at the great battle near Hastings, where the old English crown was lost and the Norman one set in its place. From that beginning the family had risen and risen, generation upon generation, marrying well and serving the crown and gathering lands, until by Mary's time they held some of the greatest titles in the realm. They were Earls of Hereford and Earls of Essex and Earls of Northampton, 3 earldoms gathered into one family, and with the titles came a sweep of estates, so vast that it is hard to take in. Manors and castles and lordships, strung right across England and along the Welsh border, accumulated patiently across centuries. To be the head of the House of Bohun was to be one of a tiny handful of men who stood at the very summit of the kingdom, below only the royal house itself, and sometimes barely below even that. And the Bohuns had not merely been rich and titled, they had stood, again and again, at the very centre of the great events of English history. And there was in the kin a stubborn tradition of pride, of independence, of a willingness to stand up even to kings. In the days of the troubles between the crown and the barons, in the century before Mary was born, the Bohun earls had been among the foremost of those powerful lords who forced the kings of England to govern by law and not by mere will. One Bohun earl had been among the leaders who wrung concessions from a tyrannical king and bound the crown within the limits of the law. Another had clashed head to head with the formidable King Edward I himself, the conqueror of Wales, in a famous confrontation over whether the king could command his earls to fight in his wars wherever he pleased. The story was long told of how that Bohun earl flatly refused the king's order to go and fight in a distant land, and of how the furious old king swore a great oath that the earl should either go or hang, and of how the earl, unbowed, swore back that he would neither go nor hang, and rode away from the king's presence with his retainers behind him. It was exactly the kind of proud defiance that ran in the blood of the house, the conviction that even the greatest of them was a partner of the crown and not merely its servant, a man who held his lands and his honour in his own right and would defend them against any king who reached too far. So the family into which Mary was born was not only one of the wealthiest in England, but one of the proudest and most storied, a house that had helped to make and to limit kings, that had fought in the fierce wars against the Welsh and the Scots and the French, that had married into the royal line more than once across the generations. They bore as their badge a white swan, an emblem of beauty and of an old half-legendary descent, and that swan would be carried on into the House of Lancaster through her, passing to her sons, so that her mighty warrior son Henry would use the swan of the Bohuns among his own devices, a small heraldic echo of the mother he had lost and the ancient family she came from. There was a strange and beautiful old tale behind that swan, a romance that the noble families of the age loved to tell of themselves, and the Bohuns claimed it as their own. It was the legend of the Swan Knight, a mysterious champion who in the old stories came gliding out of the unknown in a little boat drawn across the water by a white swan, to rescue a lady in distress and to right a great wrong, on the one condition that no one should ever ask his name or his origin. He married the lady he had saved and lived with her in happiness, until at last, after years and children, she broke the forbidden question and asked him whence he came, and at once the swan returned with the little boat, and the knight stepped into it and was drawn away across the water and never seen again, leaving his children behind to found a great line. It was a tale of mystery and loss and enchantment, and several of the proudest noble houses of Europe claimed descent from that swan-drawn knight, weaving the romance into their own family legend, and the Bohuns were among them, which is why the white swan became their emblem and their boast. Whether anyone truly believed it hardly mattered. It was a way of saying that the kin was ancient beyond memory, that its origins were lost in the golden mist of legend, that there was something half magical in its blood. And so the swan that her son would carry on his banners at the head of his armies was not merely a pretty device, but the badge of a fairy tale, a white bird out of an old enchantment. The emblem of a family that liked to imagine itself descended from a knight who came and went upon the water in a swan-drawn boat. To carry the lineage of the Bohuns was to carry the memory of centuries of glory, of a family woven into the very fabric of the realm since the days of the Conqueror. But by Mary's time, that ancient and glorious line had come, in the male line, to its end. For her father, the 7th Earl, was the last of the Bohun Earls of Hereford. He had no son to carry the name, and the swan, and the 3 ancient earldoms onward into the future. And so all of it, the entire vast accumulated grandeur of 3 centuries, the estates and the castles and the proud history, came down at last to 2 little girls, Eleanor and Mary, the final heiresses of a dying house, in whose small hands the entire future of the Bohun inheritance now rested. It is a poignant thing, the ending of a great old family, the narrowing of all those generations down to 2 orphan children, and it is the reason that Mary's marriage mattered so enormously. For whoever won her won not just a fortune, but the very inheritance of one of the oldest noble houses in England. It is time, then, to look more closely at how that inheritance came to be divided, and at the man who held it last. For the lineage of the Bohuns had become tangled over the generations with the descent of kings. This is the thing you must understand about the house Mary came into, and indeed about the narrow, brilliant world of the medieval high nobility. They were not separate from the crown, they were woven into it, by marriage after marriage, until the greatest noblemen of England were the cousins and uncles and brothers-in-law of the king. And she, when she came, would carry in her own veins the descent of more than one royal line. Through her father's mother, she came down from King Edward I, the great warrior king who had hammered Scotland and ringed Wales with his castles. For her grandmother was that king's own youngest daughter, and through her mother's line she carried something rarer and older still, the old lineage of the native princes of Wales, descending from Llywelyn the Great himself, the mightiest of all the Welsh rulers, whose daughter had married into an English family generations before, and so passed that proud bloodline down. So the little girl in the nursery was not merely rich. She was a descendant of English kings and Welsh princes, both a vessel of some of the most royal descent outside the throne itself, and blood like that, in that age, was never allowed to lie idle. Blood like that was a prize, and prizes are fought over. Her father was Humphrey de Bohun, the 7th Earl of Hereford, and he was in his day one of the most powerful noblemen in England. He held the 3 mighty earldoms together, the last of his line to do so, and he stood high in the councils of the realm. But for all his greatness, fate had dealt him a quiet and far-reaching blow. He had no son, he had 2 daughters, and no son. And in a world where titles and the bulk of vast estates passed down the male succession, the lack of a male heir was a matter of enormous consequence. It meant that when the earl died, his ancient earldoms would have no one to inherit them in the old way, and would fall into what the lawyers called abeyance, a kind of suspension, while the vast underlying wealth, all those manors and lands, would be divided up and carried away by his daughters into whatever families they married into. The greatest single concentration of noble land in England was, in other words, about to be broken in 2 and handed to whichever fortunate men could secure the hands of the Earl's 2 girls. And those 2 girls were Eleanor, the elder, and Mary, the younger, our Mary, the child of this story. The blow fell early. Mary's father, the great Earl, died while she was still a very small child, no more than 3 or 4 years old, far too young to have any memory of him at all. One day she had a father, one of the mightiest men in the kingdom, and then she did not, and the entire shape of her life was decided in that moment, though she could not have known it. For with the Earl dead, and no son to follow him. His two little daughters became, overnight, the most valuable unmarried children in all of England. Between them, they would inherit one of the largest fortunes in the land. And as was the custom of the age, the two orphaned heiresses, with all their wealth, passed into the wardship of the crown, which is to say that the king took charge of them and of their inheritance, to manage as he saw fit until they should be old enough to marry. It is a cold thing to put plainly, but in that society, a wealthy orphan was not so much a child to be cherished as an asset to be controlled, a fortune wrapped in a small person, and the right to arrange her marriage. And so to direct where all that wealth would flow was something men would pay vast sums for and scheme long years to win. Mary, who could barely walk and talk, was already, without knowing it, at the centre of a quiet and ruthless game. We should pause here and let the strangeness of that sink in, because it is one of the hardest things for us to truly feel about that distant world, the sheer cold weight that lay upon the children of the great. In our own age, we like to think of childhood as a protected time, a time set apart from the calculations of the adult world, a time for growing and playing and being loved. For a wealthy, noble child of the 14th century, there was very little of that protection. A wealthy heiress like Mary was, from the moment of her birth, and certainly from the moment of her father's death, a piece on a board, a counter in the endless game of land and lineage that the noble families of England played against one another generation after generation. Her marriage was not hers to make. It belonged to whoever held her wardship, and that person would use it, would sell it, or arrange it, or fight over it, exactly as they saw fit, with a view not to the girl's happiness, but to the advantage of a family and the flow of an inheritance. A rich young heiress might be betrothed in the cradle, married before she was 12, widowed and remarried and widowed again, while still a young woman, passed from hand to hand like a deed of property. Because in a very real sense, that is what she was, a fortune that happened to come in the shape of a person. And the system was, in its own pitiless way, entirely logical. Land was the basis of all power and all wealth in that world, and land came down through families by inheritance, and so the control of who married whom was the control of where the wealth flowed, which is to say the control of power itself. A grand marriage could raise a family to the heights, or join two fortunes into one overwhelming whole. A wardship granted by the crown, the right to manage an heir's estates and arrange an heir's marriage, was one of the most valuable gifts a king could bestow, and men schemed and paid and flattered for years to obtain such prizes. The wealthier the orphan, the fiercer the contest, and there was no orphan in England wealthier than the Bohun girls. So it is no wonder at all that she became the object of such a struggle, that grown and powerful men should plot and counterplot over the fate of a small girl in a castle in Essex. She was, quite simply, one of the greatest prizes in the kingdom, and the kingdom's greatest men were not in the habit of letting such prizes go unclaimed. There is a temptation, looking back, to judge the people of that age harshly for treating a child so, and we are right to feel the wrongness of it. But it is worth remembering too that they did not see it as we do, that to them it was simply the way her age worked, the natural order of things, no more cruel or strange than the changing of the seasons. A noble lady was expected to marry where her family directed, to bear children, to continue a line, to bring lands and alliances to her husband's house, and to find within that arranged and bargained life whatever contentment and affection she could. Many did find such contentment. Many arranged marriages grew, over time, into real bonds of love and partnership, as Mary's own would. The point is not that these people were monsters, for they were not, but that the world they lived in placed burdens upon its children, and especially upon its wealthy daughters, that we would find almost unbearable, and that Mary, from her earliest years, carried such a burden without ever having any say in the matter at all. The game was being played over her head by her elders for stakes she could not yet understand, and the outcome would decide the entire course of her days. To understand what came next, you have to meet her sister, Eleanor, and the man Eleanor married, because the two sisters and their two marriages are the hinge on which Mary's early life turns. Eleanor de Bohun was the elder by some years, old enough to be married while she was still in the nursery, and she made a match of dazzling height. She married Thomas of Woodstock, the youngest of the many sons of the old King Edward III, a prince of the blood royal, a man who would in time be made Duke of Gloucester and become one of the most formidable and ambitious figures in the kingdom. For Eleanor, it was a magnificent marriage, joining her to the very heart of the royal kin. But it carried within it a hard edge of calculation, as such marriages always did. For Thomas of Woodstock, in marrying the elder Bohun's sister, had acquired a claim to half of that immense inheritance. And being the man he was, restless and grasping and hungry for greatness, he very quickly began to think about the other half. Because here was the thing that gnawed at Thomas of Woodstock. The Bohun fortune was to be split between the two sisters. His wife Eleanor would have her half, but the other portion, Mary's share, would go to whatever family secured the younger girl and would be lost to him forever. Unless something could be arranged so that she never married at all, so that her share of the inheritance never passed out of the family, but fell instead, by one means or another, to her elder sister, and so to him. And there was, in that age, one well-worn path by which a young noblewoman might be removed from the marriage market entirely, her lands and her person taken out of play, her share quietly absorbed by those around her. She might be given to God, she might be made a nun. And so there formed in the mind of Thomas of Woodstock a plan, a cold and clever plan, for the future of his small sister-in-law. A plan that would have shut Mary away behind convent walls for all of her life, and changed the entire history of England in the doing of it. That plan, and the desperate struggle it set off, is exactly where we are going next. But to understand that struggle, we should understand the men who waged it, the two royal brothers whose rivalry decided Mary's fate, for they were sons of one of the most remarkable royal broods in English history. Their father was the old King Edward III, who had reigned for half a century in much splendour, and who had fathered a large family of sons, more surviving sons than almost any English king before or since. An entire generation of royal princes who grew up to be dukes and earls and the founders of mighty houses. In their youth, that band of brothers had been the glory of England, riding to war together in France, winning famous victories, the very flower of English chivalry. But as the old king aged and at last died, and the crown passed to a child grandson, those same princely brothers became a problem. A knot of over-mighty uncles, each with his own vast estates and his own ambitions, circling the young king and one another, jealous, proud, and dangerous. The eldest of the surviving brothers, John of Gaunt, was the greatest of them, the Duke of Lancaster, the effective ruler of the realm. And the youngest was Thomas of Woodstock, restless and resentful, the Duke of Gloucester, forever feeling that he had been born too late and given too little, forever grasping after more. It was the misfortune of Mary, and in another sense, the making of her destiny, to be caught between these two princely brothers. For the ancient Bohun inheritance that she and her sister carried became one more thing for the brothers to contend over. Thomas of Woodstock, married to the elder sister, wanted it all. John of Gaunt, with a son to provide for, was determined that Thomas should not have it. And so the quiet struggle over a small girl became one more front in the rivalry of the sons of Edward III. One more move in the endless game these proud princes played against one another for property and power and precedence. Mary was a pawn in a contest of kings' sons, and the fact that she ended up where she did, married into Lancaster, rather than buried in a convent, was the result not of any concern for her, but of the greater power and the deeper purse of the elder brother prevailing over the younger. Such was the age she was born into, a world where the fate of a child could turn upon the jealousies of royal uncles, and where the love of land could move the greatest men in the kingdom to scheme over the future of a little girl. The place where Mary spent these earliest years was Pleshy Castle, in Essex, the great stronghold of her sister and brother-in-law. And it is there that we must imagine her as a small girl, a little orphan growing up in the shadow of her formidable elder sister and that sister's even more formidable husband. It would not, on the face of it, have seemed a cruel place. She was surrounded by wealth and comfort, by the bustle of a noble household, by servants and chaplains, and the daily round of a castle at the centre of vast estates. But beneath the comfort there ran a current of cold purpose, and that purpose was bent steadily upon a single object, which was to turn Mary's heart and mind toward the cloister. From a very young age she was steered, gently and then less gently, toward a religious life. She was given over to instruction in the doctrines of the Church. She was taught to think of the veil, of the convent, of an existence of prayer and seclusion and quiet devotion behind high walls, as the natural and holy path that lay before her. To a child it might have seemed simply the way her elders wished her to go, the only future anyone ever spoke of. She could not have understood, in those seasons, the grasping motive that lay behind all that pious guidance. That the men around her wished her safely shut away, not for the good of her soul, but for the sake of her inheritance, so that her half of the Bohun fortune might never escape the kin's grasp. It is a strange and slightly chilling thing to dwell on, the careful shaping of a small girl toward a destiny chosen entirely for the benefit of others. And we should be fair to the age, for many young women did enter convents, and many found in them genuine peace and purpose, and a kind of freedom from the relentless marriage market that ground up so many noble daughters. The cloister was not always a prison. For some, it was a refuge, but for her it would have been a sentence, passed in her infancy by a man she had no power to resist, designed to take from her not only the world, but her future, and the great destiny her blood had prepared her for, and to do it all under the gentle cover of religion. Had it succeeded, she would have lived out her years as a nun in some quiet house, and she would have left no mark on her age at all, and the entire history of the English crown would have run along a different course. The boy who would one day win the most famous victory in English history would never have been born. That is how close it came, in the quiet of a castle in Essex, to never happening at all. We know little of the particulars of Mary's upbringing, but we know well enough what the education of a leading noble girl involved in that age, and we may be sure that she received it for whatever future was intended for her. Whether the cloister or a brilliant marriage, a girl of her rank was raised to a certain accomplishment. She would have been taught, first and above all, her religion, for piety was the foundation of everything, and a noble girl learned her prayers and her catechism and the great cycle of the faith from her earliest years, which, in Mary's case, was pressed all the harder because of the convent that was intended for her. She would have learned to read, at least in the devotional way that ladies read, well enough to follow the prayers in her Book of Hours and the lives of the saints, and perhaps better than that, for the women of her family were patrons of fine books and there was learning among them. She would have been taught the womanly arts that a fine lady was expected to command, above all the fine needlework and embroidery that filled so many noble hours, and the management of a household, and the graces of music and dancing and courteous conversation that were the polish of her class. She would have learned how to carry herself, how to preside, how to be a lady, absorbing from the women around her the entire unwritten code of how a high noblewoman moved through the world. And she would have learned too, simply by living among them, the ways and the values of the high aristocracy into which she had been born, the deep consciousness of rank and lineage and honour, the sense of her own place near the very summit of the age, the web of kinship that bound her to the greatest families in the land. A child raised in a castle like Pleshy, amid all the ceremony and hierarchy of a vast household, would have absorbed all of this as naturally as breathing, would have known from her earliest years exactly who she was and what was owed to her and what would one day be expected of her. By the time she came to her marriage, then child though she was, Mary would have been in many ways a finished product of her caste, a girl trained from infancy to be a highborn lady, devout, accomplished, conscious of her lineage, ready, despite her tender years, to take her place as the wife of one of the foremost young men in England. The convent had been one path prepared for her. The splendid marriage was another, and it was the second that she was now abruptly and decisively set upon. But she had a champion, though she did not know it, and her champion was the most powerful man in England after the king himself. For the scheme of Thomas of Woodstock had not gone unnoticed by his own elder brother, and that brother was a man not at all inclined to let Thomas gather such an enormous prize into his hands unopposed. His name was John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the third and most powerful of the surviving sons of old King Edward III, a prince of immense wealth and reach and ambition, a man who effectively ran the kingdom in these years while the old king faded and a child grandson waited in the wings. And John of Gaunt had a son, his eldest son, a vigorous and capable young man named Henry, who was known then by the name of the place of his birth as Henry Bolingbroke. Gaunt looked at the Bohun inheritance, at that vast half-fortune hanging in the balance, and he saw at once what his brother Thomas was trying to do, and he resolved to stop it and to take the prize for his own house instead. He would marry the little heiress to his son Henry. He would secure Mary's half of the vast inheritance for the line of Lancaster, and he would do it before his brother could shut the girl away forever. What followed had something of the quality of a rescue, even an abduction, though it was carried out with the smooth machinery of money and law rather than with drawn swords. John of Gaunt arranged for Mary to be taken out of the reach of Thomas of Woodstock. By one account, it was Mary's own aunt who did the deed, spiriting the girl away from the castle in Essex, where she was being prepared for the convent, and carrying her off to Arundel, to the castle of her mother's family, where she would be safe and where the marriage could be made. There is a small drama in that flight that is easy to pass over, and we should let ourselves feel it for a moment, the sheer human reality of it. Somewhere in this story there was a real journey, a real day on which a young girl was taken, quietly or hurriedly, out of the only home she had known, away from the sister who had raised her and the brother-in-law who had planned her future, and carried off over the country to another castle and another fate. We do not know whether she went willingly or in fear, whether she understood what was happening to her or was simply swept along by the grown people around her, whether she wept for the world she was leaving or rejoiced at her escape, or most likely felt nothing so clear as either, only the bewilderment of a child whose life was being decided over her head. We do not know whether Thomas of Woodstock raged when he found his prize had been snatched away, though we may guess that he did, for he had lost, at a stroke, the grand inheritance he had schemed so long to gather. What we know is that the thing was done, swiftly and effectively, by the most powerful man in England, and that little Mary was borne away to Arundel and into a wholly different future, and that the later history of England turned upon that quiet abduction of a child. Gaunt, for his part, opened his very deep purse. He paid an enormous sum to the crown, which held the wardship of the Bohun heiresses, for the right to marry Mary to his son, a sum running to thousands of marks, a fortune in itself, which tells you exactly how valuable the prize was reckoned to be. And so, with the girl secured and the wardship bought, the marriage went ahead. Mary de Bohun was joined in wedlock to Henry Bolingbroke, the son of the greatest magnate in the land, and her half of the Bohun inheritance, the earldom of Northampton and all the lands that went with it, passed into the keeping of the House of Lancaster. The cloister door, which had stood open before her, swung shut, and a different door opened in its place. The man who had done this, who had reached into her life and changed its direction, deserves a closer look, for John of Gaunt was one of the towering figures of the entire 14th century, and he would be, for the rest of her short life, the great power standing behind Mary's marriage and her family. He was a son of King Edward the third of the old king's sons to survive to manhood, and by Mary's day, with his father grown senile and one elder brother dead, he had become the most powerful single man in all of England, a prince of immense wealth and reach, who effectively governed the realm in the king's failing name. His power rested above all on a marriage of his own, for in his youth he had wed the rich heiress of the House of Lancaster, and through her he had inherited the largest and richest private estate in the kingdom. A duchy in all but name, with castles and lands and revenues that dwarfed those of any other subject. From his wife he took the title Duke of Lancaster, and he made of the Lancastrian inheritance a power so great that it stood almost as a rival to the crown itself, a state within the state. To be the heir to John of Gaunt, as his son Henry was to be heir to a position of almost royal grandeur. He was a restless and ambitious man, this Duke, and his ambitions reached far beyond England. Through a second marriage to a Spanish princess, he had acquired a claim to the throne of the Kingdom of Castile in faraway Spain, and for years he nursed the dream of winning that crown and reigning as a king in his own right, even leading an expensive and ultimately fruitless expedition to Spain to make the claim good. He was a soldier, a diplomat, a patron, a schemer, a man whose hand was in everything, and whose shadow fell across all of his age. And he was not, it must be said, much loved by the common people of England, who blamed him, fairly or not, for the failures and corruptions of the government he dominated, and who, in one terrible rising, even burned his magnificent palace in London to the ground. But loved or not, he was the indispensable man, the great prop of the throne, the head of the mightiest family in the land beneath the king, and his will shaped the kingdom. It was this man who decided that Mary de Bohun should marry his son, and once such a man had decided a thing, it was as good as done. For Gaunt, the marriage was a stroke of policy of the highest order. It secured for his own house half of the greatest noble inheritance in England, the Bohun estates and the earldom of Northampton, adding yet more weight to the already enormous Lancastrian power. It thwarted his own brother Thomas, whose grasping after the entire Bohun fortune Gaunt had no intention of allowing, and it provided his heir with a bride of the most exalted blood, a girl descended from kings and princes, fit in every way to be the mother of the line that would carry Lancaster into the future. That the bride was a child, that she had been destined for the cloister, that she had to be spirited away and her wardship bought at vast expense. None of this troubled Gaunt in the slightest. He saw a prize and he took it, smoothly and decisively as he took everything. And in doing so, he set the future of the English crown upon a new and unexpected course, though not even he, with all his cunning, could have foreseen where it would lead. That the marriage he had arranged as a matter of land and policy would one day put his own descendants upon the throne of England and bring forth the conqueror of France. Years later, after Mary herself was dead, this same John of Gaunt would die full of years and honour, and it would be the seizing of his vast inheritance by a jealous king that drove his son Henry to rebellion and to the throne. But all of that lay far in the future, for now the great Duke had married his son to the little Bohun heiress, and the young couple were left to begin their strange wedded life together, 2 children bound for the rest of their days. While the powerful old men who had arranged it turned to other business. It was a triumph for John of Gaunt and a bitter defeat for his brother Thomas, and it strained the bond between the two royal brothers for seasons to come. For Thomas never forgave the snatching away of that great prize he had thought as good as his. But for Mary herself, what did it mean? We must be honest about what this marriage was and what it was not, because it is easy across the gulf of centuries to dress these things up in a romance that was not there at the start. Mary was a child. At the time of her wedding, she was perhaps 12 years old, possibly a little less. A girl barely on the edge of her teens, and her husband Henry was himself only a boy of around 14. They were married not because they loved each other, for they scarcely knew each other, but because two powerful families were contending for a fortune. And this was how that contest was settled. Two children were joined together at the altar to decide the fate of an inheritance and to thwart the ambitions of an uncle. That was the medieval way at the highest levels of society, where marriage was an instrument of property and power long before it was anything to do with the heart, and where the feelings of a 12-year-old girl counted for very little against the weight of land and lineage. We may picture the wedding itself in the chapel of the vast castle at Arundel, the proud Fitzalan stronghold of her mother's family, on a winter or summer day in the early 1380s. There would have been all the ceremony that such an alliance demanded, for this was no ordinary match, but the joining of one of the foremost inheritances in England to the heir of the mightiest house in the land, and the mighty ones would have gathered to witness it. There would have been the priest at the chapel door, the vows exchanged, the nuptial mass, the feasting afterward in the castle hall. There would have been Mary in her wedding finery, a small girl of 12 dressed as a great lady, and beside her the boy of 14, who was now her husband, the two of them at the centre of all that adult ceremony, joined for life by the will of the powerful men who had arranged it. What the two children made of one another on that day, whether they looked at each other with curiosity or shyness or indifference, whether they exchanged any word at all beyond the words the rite required, we cannot tell. They were strangers, joined by treaty, two young people who would now have to find their way down the years to come toward whatever understanding or affection they could build out of so cold a beginning, and build it in the event they did, though neither of them could have known that on the day they were wed. For now there was only the ceremony, and the feast, and the great alliance sealed, and two children at the heart of it, who had not chosen any of it. And because she was so young, there was a further arrangement, one we should speak of plainly, and then pass over with care. John of Gaunt, who had bought this marriage, intended that it should be a marriage in name only for some seasons to come. The plan was that the couple should live apart or live as children together, and that the marriage should not be made fully a marriage in the bodily sense until Mary had grown older, until she had reached the age of 16, by which point her body would be more ready for what that age expected of a wife. It was, by the harsh standards of the time, a gesture toward her welfare, an acknowledgement that she was too young. But in the event that intention was not honoured, the couple did not wait, and so Mary found herself, while still only 14 years old, carrying her first child, a girl barely more than a child herself about to bear one. We will not dwell on it beyond the plain fact, for it sits uneasily with everything we now believe about childhood, and rightly so. But it is part of her story, and it is part of the truth of that distant and very different world. And we must let it stand as the simple fact it was, and feel, perhaps, a quiet sorrow for the girl at the centre of it, handed from one set of grown men's plans to another, while she was still so very young. So let us leave the scheming and the bargaining behind now, for that part of her life is over, and let us turn to the life Mary actually lived, once the fierce struggle over her fate had been settled. But before we do, let us pause for one moment over the life she did not live, the road that was so nearly hers, and that she escaped by the narrowest of margins, because it casts everything that followed in a sharper light. Had Thomas of Woodstock had his way, Mary would have spent her entire existence behind the high walls of a convent. We should try to picture what that would have meant, for it was a real and complete world of its own, the existence of a medieval nun. She would have risen in the cold and the dark, many times in the night and the early morning, to sing the offices, the endless round of prayer and psalm that was the heartbeat of the cloister. The same prayers at the same hours, day after day, season after season, for all of a lifetime. She would have lived enclosed, set apart, her days governed by the bell and the rule, her world shrunk to the chapel and the cloister and the chapter house and the little walled garden. She would have worn the habit, taken the vows, given up forever the possibility of marriage and children and the wider world outside, and devoted herself wholly to God and to prayer. For some women, as we have said, that calling was a true vocation and a real fulfillment, a refuge and a freedom. But for her, it would have been a destiny chosen for her by a grasping brother-in-law. A living burial undertaken, not for the love of God, but for the love of land, and it would have shut away forever all of the life she was actually to lead. And think what that would have meant, not only for Mary, but for her age. There would have been no marriage to Henry Bolingbroke. There would have been no 6 children, no brood of royal dukes, no Queen of the North. Above all, there would have been no boy born at Monmouth in the autumn of 1386. No Henry V, no victory on that muddy field, no conquest of France. The entire glittering history that flowed from Mary's marriage would simply never have happened, and England would have taken a different road into its future, and one of the most famous chapters in its long story would never have been written. All of it hung, for a few years in Mary's childhood, upon the outcome of a quiet struggle over a small girl in a castle in Essex, upon whether she would be shut away or married off, upon which of 2 powerful men would have his way with her fate. It is a vertiginous thing to contemplate, how much turned upon so little, how the future of a kingdom balanced for a moment upon the question of what would become of one obscure child. She was rescued from the cloister, and so the history we know came to pass. Had she not been, the world would be different in ways we can scarcely imagine. That is the weight that rested, all unknowing, upon the little girl at Pleshy. And now let us turn to the life she actually lived, once the struggle over her fate was settled. Because, for all the coldness of how it began, the marriage into which she had been thrust would turn out to be, by the standards of its time, a remarkably warm and fruitful one. And the years that followed would be filled, not with the chill of the convent she had narrowly escaped, but with castles and households and a great cradle of children, with a husband often absent on grand adventures, and a wife quietly running a sprawling domestic sphere of her own. To understand those years, we need first to understand what the daily life of a great medieval lady was actually like, the texture of her days, the shape of her year, the age she moved through. Come with me into that age now, into the long galleries and the candlelit chambers, and let us see what it was to be a young noblewoman in the England of 600 years ago. The life of a fine lady in the 14th century was an existence lived almost entirely within doors and within walls, a round of interiors, of chambers and halls and chapels and the enclosed gardens of castles. And we should let those interiors take shape around us now. Imagine the private chambers of a young noblewoman like Mary, high in the warmest part of a castle, away from the smoke and noise of the great hall below. The walls would be hung with woven cloths and painted hangings to keep out the damp and the cold of the stone, deep reds and blues and greens, scenes of hunts and gardens and the stories of old. The floors would be strewn with fresh rushes mingled with sweet herbs, lavender and meadow sweet, so that a clean green scent rose up as one walked. There would be a vast curtained bed, the most valuable piece of furniture a family owned, hung about with embroidered hangings that could be drawn closed against the draughts and the dark. There would be carved chests holding her gowns and her linens and her jewels. And there would be light, the soft, uneven light of beeswax candles and oil lamps, and the fire on the hearth, light that flickered and breathed and was nothing at all like the steady glare we live by now. Light that left the corners of every room in a gentle, living shadow. Her days would have moved to the slow rhythm of a world without clocks, as we know them. A world that measured time by the bells of the chapel and the turning of the light. She would rise early, in the grey of the morning, and hear Mass in the castle chapel, for the existence of a devout lady was threaded through with prayer from waking to sleeping. There would be the ordering of her noble household, for a lady of Mary's rank presided over a small army of servants and officials, a steward and a chamberlain, cooks and grooms and maids and clerks. And the smooth running of that household was very much her business, her domain, her work. There would be meals taken in the hall, with all the ceremony the aged loved, the washing of hands, the procession of dishes, the careful seating that placed every soul in its exact degree. There would be needlework, fine embroidery worked in coloured silks and threads of gold, an art at which noble ladies were expected to excel and which filled the hours of many an afternoon. There would be music, perhaps, and the telling of tales, and the slow turning of the pages of beautiful books. And always, behind it all, there would be the changing of the seasons outside the windows, the world greening and ripening and fading and freezing through the medieval year, and the great feasts of the church marking out the time. Christmas and Easter and Whitsun and all the holy days between. It was, in many ways, a sheltered life, an enclosed and protected life. And yet it was also an existence of constant movement. For the vast households of the age did not stay in one place. They travelled. A family like Mary's held many castles and manors scattered across the country, and they moved between them through the year, partly to oversee their far-flung estates, partly because a household of hundreds would quickly exhaust the food and supplies of any one place and had to move on to be fed from the next. So Mary's years would have been spent shifting from one noble house to another, packing up the hangings and the plate and the precious volumes into carts and chests, riding the muddy roads of medieval England with a long train of servants and baggage, and settling for a season in this castle or that manor before moving on again. She would come to know the strongholds of her husband's family and her own, the castle at Kenilworth in its lake, the Marcher fortresses along the Welsh border, the manors of the Midland Shires. Home for her was not a single place, but a way of living, carried from house to house, a movable world of cloth and candle and prayer. And we should not imagine that a lady's life within those walls was an idle or a powerless one, for all that it was enclosed. A fine noble woman of Mary's rank wielded a real and considerable authority, the authority of the mistress of a vast household and the manager of wide estates. And that authority grew all the greater precisely because her husband was so often away. When Henry was off at the wars or on crusade or attending the king in London, it was Mary who held the centre, who presided over the establishment, who saw that the estates were run, and the servants ordered, and the house's affairs kept in good order. The medieval noblewoman was, in a very real sense, the deputy and partner of her lord, trusted to hold his lands and his interests while he was absent. And many such women showed themselves formidably capable in the role defending castles in time of war, managing far-flung properties, conducting business, exercising the patronage and the charity and the intercession that were expected of a noble lady. She was the heart of a small kingdom of her own, the household, with its hierarchy of officials and servants, all answering ultimately to her. And the keeping of that kingdom in good order through the long absences of its lord was no small thing. We should picture Mary, then, not merely as a decorative consort, but as a woman of consequence in her own sphere, busy, capable, in command of her own world, even as the wider realm of kings and wars went on without her. It is worth pausing too on the wider age in which all of this unfolded, for the 14th century into which Mary was born was one of the most turbulent and terrible in the entire history of Europe. An age of catastrophe piled upon catastrophe, only a generation before her birth. A pestilence beyond anything in living memory had swept across the continent and the island, the vast mortality that later ages would call the Black Death. A plague so virulent and so deadly that it carried off, by the best reckoning, something close to half of the entire population in the space of a few horrifying years. Whole villages were emptied, families wiped out, the dead so many that there were scarcely the living to bury them. The world Mary came into was a world still reeling from that catastrophe, still half empty, its old certainties shaken. And the plague would return again and again across her lifetime, in lesser but still fearful visitations, so that the shadow of sudden mass death was never far from anyone's mind. It was also an age of almost ceaseless war, for England and France were locked in the generation-spanning struggle that history would call the 100 Years' War, a conflict that had already raged for decades before Mary's birth and would rage on for decades after her death, draining the wealth and the blood of both kingdoms and shaping the entire politics of the age. The same war that her son would one day carry to its bloodiest and most triumphant height. And it was an age of deep religious anxiety and ferment, of questioning and dissent stirring beneath the surface of the universal church. The first faint tremors of upheavals that would shake the Christian world in centuries to come. This was the age Mary lived in, a hard, dangerous, beautiful, frightening age, soaked in faith and blood, and the constant nearness of dying. And we should hold it in our minds as the backdrop to her quiet, enclosed life, the vast dark weather of the age behind the candle-lit chamber. But let us come back in from that vast dark weather, back to the warmth and the colour of her own immediate sphere, and let us imagine, for a while, one of the great occasions of her life, a feast. For the feast was the supreme expression of noble life in that age, the moment when a sprawling household displayed itself in all its glory. Picture the hall on such a day, perhaps at one of the high festivals of the year, lit by a great fire roaring in the hearth and by ranks of candles, the walls hung with the finest tapestries. The high table set upon its dais with a cloth of dazzling white linen and a glittering array of silver and gilt, the salt cellar in its place of honour, the cups and the ewers gleaming. Imagine the company gathering in their finest array, the men in their rich parti-coloured robes, the women in their flowing gowns and elaborate headdresses, the bright plumage of the medieval aristocracy on display. There would be the ceremony of the washing of hands, the procession of the great dishes carried in by the servants, course after course of an abundance almost beyond our imagining, roasted meats of every kind, swans and peacocks and herons brought to the table in their own feathers, rich pies and subtleties, the cooked confections shaped into castles and beasts and scenes that were the pride of the medieval kitchen. There would be wine and ale flowing freely, and the music of minstrels in the gallery, and perhaps the entertainments that such feasts loved, the tumblers and the jugglers, the singing, the telling of tales. And presiding over it all, in her place at the high table, the young mistress of the house, Mary, in her finest gown, doing the honours of her husband's hall, the very image of a noble lady in her glory. And then imagine the other face of that life, the ceaseless moving. For as we have heard, the family never stayed long in one place. Picture a day of departure when the whole travelling town of a noble household set out upon the road. Several hundred souls in a long winding procession, the lords and ladies mounted, the baggage carts creaking behind, the servants trudging in the dust, the column moving slowly over the countryside, fording the rivers, climbing the hills, passing through the villages where the common folk came out to gape at the passing of the mighty. Such a journey might take days, with nights spent at abbeys or lesser manors along the way. And at the end of it, the whole company would pour into the next castle and take up again the round of its life there, until the time came to set out once more. It is a way of living almost impossible for us to picture now, this endless shifting of an entire domestic world from one seat to another. And yet it was the ordinary rhythm of Mary's years, the settling and the moving and the settling again, through the turning seasons, and somewhere always at the heart of it, ordering it and presiding over it, the young woman whose story we are following through the dark towards sleep. And since her life was lived so much in these proud strongholds, let us walk for a moment among them, the castles that were the stage of her short existence. For each had its own character, and each played its part in her story. There was Pleshy in the flatlands of Essex, the stronghold of her sister and her scheming brother-in-law, where she spent her shadowed childhood under the threat of the convent. A place of comfort and quiet menace, where her entire future hung in the balance. There was Arundel, the mighty fortress of her mother's family on the south coast, rising proud above its town, to which she was carried in the bold rescue, and where, by some accounts, her marriage was made, a house of refuge and of beginning. There was Monmouth, the Marcher castle in the green hills of the Welsh border, where she gave birth to the son who would be a king, a strong grey stronghold on the very frontier of Wales. There was Kenilworth, loveliest of them all, the vast red fortress floating upon its broad artificial lake in the heart of England, where the kin spent their golden summers among the children, the most beautiful of all the houses of her days. There was Hereford, where the extended family gathered to keep Christmas together in the deep of winter after old John of Gaunt came home from abroad. And there was Peterborough, in the watery fenland of the east, the last of her castles, the place where she went into her final confinement and did not come out again, where her brief existence reached its quiet ending. Each of these places stood for centuries, some of them still standing in some form to this day. Vast piles of weathered stone that have outlasted by half a millennium the woman who once moved through their halls. To walk among their ruins now, or to stand before those of them that still rise against the sky, is to walk where Mary walked, to stand where she once stood, in the same courtyards and beneath the same towers. Though the woman herself is 600 years gone, the stones remember nothing, of course. They are only stones. But for us, knowing her story, they can become something more, vessels of memory, places where the past presses close, where we can imagine, if we let ourselves, the swish of a long gown across a flagged floor, the voice of a young mother calling to her children, the soft light of candles in a high chamber, the vanished life that once filled these now empty or ruined or repurposed walls. The castles are the bones of her world, and they endure, and through them, as through her books, we can reach a little way back toward the living woman who once called them home. And it was into this moving, sheltered, candlelit world that her children began to come, one after another, year after year, for she proved to be, despite her youth and her slight frame, a mother many times over. The first of them, as we have heard, came when she was perhaps 14, far too young, and the early days of her childbearing are shadowed and uncertain in the records, with some hint that a first infant did not survive its earliest days, though the truth of it is lost to us now, and the accounts are tangled. What is certain, and what matters, is the child who came to her in the autumn of 1386, in a castle on the Welsh border. For that child would grow into one of the most celebrated figures in the entire long history of England. The place was Monmouth Castle, a stronghold of her husband's in the Green Hill country where Wales and England meet. And before we go into the birth chamber, we should pause a moment over that country, the country of the Welsh Marches, because it was a world unto itself, and it was the realm into which the future conqueror of France was born. The Marches were the long band of borderland that ran down the western edge of England, where it met the mountains of Wales, a wild and contested country that for centuries had been neither fully English nor fully Welsh, but something between a frontier land. Here the mighty lords held their lands, not as ordinary English barons did, but as something closer to little kings, the Marcher lords, who ruled their territories almost as independent princes, with their own laws and their own courts and their own private armies, a legacy of the bloody centuries in which the Norman and English lords had pushed slowly westward into Wales, castle by castle, valley by valley, wresting the land from its native princes. It was a region of strong stone fortresses, set on every height, of steep wooded valleys and fast rivers, of a hardy border people, of two languages and two peoples mingling uneasily along the line where the lowlands gave way to the hills. And there was a fitting symmetry, though no one could have seen it then, in the birth of Mary's eldest son in that borderland. For the blood of the old Welsh princes ran in his veins through his mother, and he would be born almost within sight of the mountains his distant Welsh ancestors had once ruled. The boy who would be called Henry of Monmouth came into the age on the very frontier of Wales in a Marcher castle of his father's, a child of the borderland. There was even, in later years, a Welsh strand woven into the imagery of his greatness, a sense that this conquering king carried something of the old British blood, but all of that was far away and unguessable on the September day when he was born. For now there was only a new mother in a border fortress, and the labour coming on, and the women gathering in the shuttered chamber as the autumn light faded over the Welsh hills. It was there, on that September day, that Mary was delivered of a son. They named him Henry, after his father, and he would be known, after the place of his birth, as Henry of Monmouth. Picture the scene as it would have been. The birth chamber sealed and shuttered and warmed against the early autumn air. The women of the household gathered close. The long and dangerous labour that every delivery then was, for childbirth in that age, was the most perilous thing a woman regularly did, and many did not survive it. But Mary survived it, and so did the boy. And the cry of that infant in the candlelit chamber at Monmouth was the cry of a child who would one day be King Henry V of England, the victor of the most famous battle his country ever fought, the conqueror who would lead English armies deep into France and very nearly join the two crowns under his own head. All of that lay ahead, unimaginable, unguessable. For now he was simply a baby at his young mother's breast, in a border castle, in the autumn light, and Mary was a girl of perhaps 18, holding her son, and with no inkling of what he would become. The birth of that boy would have been an occasion of great joy and great importance in the household, for it was the coming of a son and an heir, the thing that every high marriage existed above all to produce. A noble family lived for its continuance, for the carrying on of its name and its blood and its lands into the next generation. And the coming of a healthy son was the surest sign that the line would go on, that the marriage had done its essential work. There would have been rejoicing then, in the castle at Monmouth, messages sent out, perhaps the ringing of bells and the lighting of fires, thanks given in the chapel for the safe delivery of the child and the survival of the mother. The father, wherever he was, would have heard the news with the deep satisfaction of a man whose house now had its heir. And Mary, recovering in her chamber, would have known that she had done what was most expected of her, had given her husband and his noble family a son, had secured her own place and her own worth in the hard reckoning of that age, where a wife's value was measured above all in the sons she bore. She could not have known how much more this particular son would come to mean, how the baby in her arms would grow into a name that would ring down the centuries. To her, he was simply her boy, her firstborn living son. the child she had carried and brought safely into the world, and that was joy enough for any young mother in any age. After that first surviving son, the children came thick and fast, a brood of them, filling the nurseries of one of the leading houses of the land, and they are worth naming, because between them they would grow up to rule and shape not only England, but a good part of Europe. After Henry came another son, Thomas, born the following year, who would be made Duke of Clarence and grow into a bold and headstrong soldier. Then came John, born a couple of years later, a steady and capable boy who would become Duke of Bedford and one of the ablest men of his generation. Then Humphrey, the youngest of the 4 sons, who would be made Duke of Gloucester and become a glittering, quarrelsome, learned, and troublesome prince. 4 sons, one after another, each of whom would grow into a duke and a power in the land. And then, at last, came daughters, 2 of them, Blanche and Philippa, the elder named for Henry's own long-dead mother, and the younger for his grandmother, the old queen. So in the space of a little more than a decade, this girl who had so nearly been shut away in a convent had instead become the mother of 6 living children, 4 sons and 2 daughters. An entire generation of the House of Lancaster gathered around her in the firelight of one castle or another. Try to picture what that household must have been like in those crowded years, a noble nursery filling steadily with children, and at the heart of it, a new mother who was herself barely more than a girl when it all began. Each of those babies, in the way of the great houses, would have been given over to a wet nurse and a train of attendants. For a lady of Mary's rank did not raise her children with her own hands alone, but presided over a staff of nurses and rockers and servants devoted to the care of the young. There would have been a nursery establishment of its own, with its own officers and its own quarters, moving with the rest of the household from castle to castle. And yet, for all the attendance and the formality, there was surely also the ordinary warm chaos of a house full of small children, the noise and the laughter and the tears, the first words and the first steps, the squabbles and the games, the tender uproar of early childhood, multiplied many times over as the brood grew. We may imagine Mary among them, the young mistress of this growing tribe, watching her sons begin to grow into boys, the elder ones starting their education and their training in the arts of their caste, while the little ones were still in arms. We may imagine the pride and the worry and the love that any mother knows, set against the particular dangers of an age in which children died so easily, so that no parent could ever take for granted that the child living today would be living next year. For that was the shadow over every medieval nursery, however grand and well attended, the terrible frailty of young life in that age, when so many children, even the children of the richest and most powerful, were carried off by the fevers and the fluxes and the plagues that no medicine could touch. She herself, as we have seen, very likely lost at least one infant in the earliest days of her childbearing, a sorrow that touched almost every family of the time. To raise 6 children all the way to adulthood, as she did, was in that age no small achievement, a matter as much of fortune as of care, and it speaks of a household well ordered and a mother attentive to her brood, even amid all the moving and the dangers and the long absences of their father. These were, in the main, the good years of her life, the seasons of the growing family, the house full of children, the marriage settled into its warm and fruitful middle. She had escaped the cloister and found instead this, a great, noisy, loving household of her own, a brood of sons and daughters who would one day astonish her age, gathered about her in the firelight while she was still young enough, almost, to be one of them. And by every sign that has come down to us, faint and few though those signs are, it was a happy household, a warm one, far warmer than the cold bargain of its beginning would have led anyone to expect. Mary and Henry seem to have grown genuinely fond of one another across these years of children and shared life. There is one small detail that has survived the erosion of time and that tells us perhaps more than any document could. A record that on one occasion when Henry was away in London on the business of the realm, he sent home to his wife a gift, a shipment of fresh apples and pears, carried up the roads to wherever she was keeping their home. It is a tiny thing, a basket of fruit across 600 years, and yet it glows. It is the gesture of a husband thinking of his wife, of a man who wanted to send something sweet to the woman, keeping his home and raising his children while he was away. From such small surviving fragments, we build our picture of a marriage that began as a transaction over land and became, somewhere along the way, something gentler and truer, a real partnership of two people who had been thrown together as children and had made, out of that hard beginning, a life. But Henry was not by nature a man content to sit by his own fireside, and the apples and pears were sent precisely because he was so often away, for he was one of the most restless and adventurous young noblemen of his generation. And the years of Mary's childbearing were also the span of his wandering. Let us look more closely at this man Mary had married, for he is worth knowing in his own right, quite apart from the throne he would one day seize. Henry Bolingbroke, in these years of his marriage to Mary, was the very model of what a noble youth of the age was supposed to be, and more besides. He was vigorous, athletic, brave, accomplished in all the martial arts that his caste prized above everything. He was, above all, a famous jouster, one of the finest of his time, who rode in the grand tournaments that were the glittering theatre of medieval chivalry. Those ritualized contests of skill and courage in which the young nobility displayed their prowess before the watching court. He travelled abroad to take part in such contests, winning renown across Europe. The bold young Englishman who could hold his own against the best knights of any land. He was musical too, and cultivated, with a taste for fine things, for books and music and rich display. He was pious in the conventional way of his age, a man who went on crusade and pilgrimage and gave generously to the church, and he was ambitious and capable and proud, a man who knew his own worth, the heir to the greatest inheritance in England, conscious of his royal blood and his high place in the world. This was the husband Mary had been given, this glittering, restless, accomplished young man. And whatever else may be said of the cold bargain that joined them, she had not been matched with a dullard or a brute. And the marriage, as we have seen, grew into something real, something warm, across the seasons of their shared life. We should not paint it in colours too bright, for we know so little. And the loss of an infant, and the absences, and the relentless round of childbearing must have brought their share of grief and loneliness. But the signs we have all point one way, toward affection, toward partnership, toward a genuine bond between these two who had been joined as children. They spent their time together when they could, in the intervals between Henry's wanderings and his duties. They produced their large brood of children across a dozen close-spaced years, which speaks at the least of a marriage that was no mere formality. And there is that small, luminous detail, the apples and pears sent up the road from London. The husband thinking of his wife, that tells us more than any formal record could. In a world where marriage at the highest level was a matter of land and policy, where husbands and wives were chosen for one another by their elders and were often little more than strangers, Mary and Henry seem to have found, in the years they were given, something better than they had any right to expect, a real and tender companionship grown out of an arranged and bargained beginning. It is one of the quietly hopeful things about her story, this warmth at the heart of it, this evidence that even in that hard transactional world, the human heart could find its way toward love. But love, or no love, Henry was often gone, off seeing the world on a grand and dangerous scale, while Mary kept the household and bore the children and moved between the family's castles. Her husband was away, chasing glory and adventure across the face of Europe. For Henry Bolingbroke, the heir to the greatest fortune in England, had the soul of a crusader and a knight-errant. His greatest expedition took him to the very edge of the known Christian earth, to the cold forests and frozen marshes of the far northeast of Europe, to the land then called Prussia and the wild pagan country of Lithuania beyond it. There, on the last great frontier of Christendom, a brotherhood of warrior monks, the Teutonic Knights, waged a long and brutal holy war against the heathen peoples who still held out against the cross, and to that war came knights and noblemen from all over Europe, eager to win renown and to do battle for their faith. Henry Bolingbroke went among them, sailing across the northern seas with a large retinue, and he campaigned in those frozen wastes, taking part in sieges and raids in a land of deep snow and dark pine forests, utterly unlike the soft green country of home. He spent lavishly and fought hard, and made a name for himself among the chivalry of Europe. The bold young Englishman who had come so far to fight. And while he did all this, Mary was at home in England with the children, keeping the lamps lit and the household running, hearing only by slow and uncertain report how her husband fared in those distant and dangerous places. It is worth dwelling on the strangeness of that northern adventure, on how very far it carried him from the world of his wife and children. To go crusading in Prussia was to sail to the very rim of the known earth, beyond the bounds of ordinary Christendom, into a frozen frontier land of vast forests and dark lakes and pagan peoples who worshipped the old gods of the woods and the waters. The warrior monks who ruled that frontier, the Teutonic Knights, kept a considerable state in their grim brick castles, and they welcomed the noble visitors who came from all over Europe to join their endless war, feasting them and honouring them and leading them out on the brutal winter raids into the heathen country. Henry travelled in high state, with a large company of knights and servants, and all the apparatus of a great lord, and he threw himself into that war with all the energy of his restless nature, present at the siege of a great pagan stronghold, winning the praise of his hosts, spending money on a lavish scale, and bringing home, when at last he returned, exotic treasures and strange tales of that far country at the very edge of the world. For a young man hungry for glory and adventure, it was the supreme experience of the age, and Henry drank it to the full. While back in England, his young wife marked the seasons and raised his children and waited for word of him across the immense distance. And then, having seen the frozen north, he turned his eyes to the burning south, to the holiest goal of all, and set out upon the long road to Jerusalem. This was a different kind of journey altogether, not a war, but a pilgrimage, the supreme act of devotion that a Christian of that age could undertake, and it carried him across the entire length of Europe and the sea beyond, through one famous city and kingdom after another. He travelled in honour and was received with great ceremony by the princes and rulers whose lands he passed through, for he was a famous man now, the crusading son of the mightiest lord in England. And his journey was a kind of royal progress across the continent. He passed through famous cities, was feasted and honoured, gathered relics and memories, and came at last to the holy city itself, to Jerusalem, to kneel and pray at the most sacred places in all the world, the very ground where Christ had walked and died. It was the fulfillment of the deepest longing of medieval faith, and Henry, for all his worldliness and ambition, seems to have felt it deeply. And then he turned for home, the road back to the wife and children he had not seen for many months, to the green country of England and the candlelit castles where Mary kept his household and raised his sons and daughters, waiting as ever for the wanderer to return. We should let ourselves feel In all of this, the shape of Mary's experience of her marriage, which was so largely an experience of absence and waiting. Her husband saw the frozen forests of the pagan north and the holy stones of Jerusalem, the mighty cities of Europe and the courts of foreign princes. He had adventures that would furnish a lifetime of tales. And she, all the while, saw the inside of her castles, the round of her household, the faces of her children, the same chapels and chambers and changing seasons, year upon year. The world beyond was her husband's. The enclosed sphere was hers. It was the common bargain of noble marriage in that age. And Mary kept her side of it faithfully, holding the centre while her husband roamed, raising the next generation of a mighty house, while its head pursued his glory at the ends of the earth. There is no record that she complained, no record that she did anything but what was expected of her, the patient keeping of the hearth. And we may hope that the returns, when they came, the husband home at last with his tales and his treasures, the kin gathered again, were sweet enough to set against the absences. We should dwell for a moment not on the journey, but on the one who stayed behind. For while Henry was away on that pilgrimage, gone for the better part of a year and more, it was Mary who held everything steady in his absence. So long a road into the unknown was a leap into real danger, and there would have been stretches when no word came at all, when she could not have known whether her husband still lived, whether some fever or shipwreck or the sword of a distant land had taken him, or whether he was even then upon the road home. She kept the household through all of it. She raised the children, ordered the servants, oversaw the far-flung estates, and waited, month upon uncertain month, for tidings that arrived, when they arrived, already weeks stale. This was the hidden labour of the noble wife, that the patient holding of an entire small kingdom, steady while its Lord chased glory and salvation at the ends of the earth, a strength and a steadiness that the chronicles, busy with the deeds of men, almost never trouble to record. Mary bore it, uncomplaining so far as anything tells us, through absence after absence, a young wife holding the centre, while her husband was away at the far edge of the world, with no way to hasten his return, or even to know, from one week to the next, whether he would return at all. We catch a glimpse, here and there, of the house briefly together between these wanderings, and those glimpses are precious. There was a Christmas after Henry's father, John of Gaunt, had at last come home from his own long absence abroad, when the extended family gathered at one of the proud Bohun castles to keep the feast together. The old Duke and his son and Mary and the children, all under one roof in the deep of winter, with the fires roaring and the hall hung with greenery and the dark nights of the Christmas season filled, we may hope, with warmth and music and the noise of children. And there were the summers at Kenilworth, that most beautiful of castles set in its wide gleaming lake, where the family spent the warm months together among the children before the call of London, or the lure of some new adventure drew Henry away once more. These were the good years, the settled years, the years of the growing brood and the fond, if often interrupted, marriage. Mary could not have known how few of them she would be given. For there is another side to this woman that we should not pass by, a private and inward side. And it is one of the few things about her that has left a real trace down the centuries. Mary de Bohun was, by all the signs, a genuinely devout and cultivated woman, and the kin she came from were among the great patrons of one of the most beautiful arts of the medieval age, the art of the illuminated book. In an age before printing, when every book was written out and decorated entirely by hand, such a book was a thing of almost unimaginable richness and labour, its pages covered in tiny, exquisite paintings in brilliant colours and burnished gold. Scenes from Scripture and the lives of the saints, borders teeming with flowers and birds and strange little figures, every inch the work of master craftsmen over months and seasons. The Bohun family kept their own workshop of such artists, and the prayer books made for them are among the loveliest that survive from all of medieval England. And some of those books were made for her, her own psalters and books, the private devotional treasures that a fine lady carried with her and prayed from daily, turning those glowing pages by candlelight as she said her prayers. Through those surviving volumes we can reach, just a little, toward the inner life of a woman who left almost no words of her own behind. We can see what she prayed over, what images of holiness and beauty filled her hours of devotion, what her eyes rested on in the quiet of her chamber. We can imagine her at her prayers in the flickering light, a young mother with a house full of children and a husband off at the ends of the earth, finding in those jeweled pages a few moments of stillness and grace. The medieval world was a deeply religious one, soaked in faith in a way that is hard for us now to fully feel. And for a woman like Mary, that faith was not a thing apart from life, but the very air she breathed. The frame around everything. Her psalters are her quiet legacy, the nearest thing we have to her own voice, and they tell us of a thoughtful, devout, and cultivated soul, a woman of real inner richness, and not merely a vessel for an inheritance and a womb for an heir, which is so often all the records of such women allow us to see. It is worth taking a moment too to look around at the wider family into which Mary's marriage had brought her, for she had married not just a man, but a vast and powerful clan, the House of Lancaster, in all its branching greatness. And her children would grow up among a thick web of royal and noble kin. Her father-in-law, the mighty John of Gaunt, had been married more than once, and from his marriages and his other connections there sprang an entire tribe of half-relations who would be the uncles and aunts and cousins of Mary's children. By his first wife, the Lancastrian heiress, Gaunt had a son, Mary's own husband Henry, and daughters too, who married into the royal houses of Spain and Portugal, carrying the Lancastrian blood into the Iberian kingdoms, so that the queens of those lands were Mary's husband's own sisters. By a later connection, a famous attachment to a woman who was for years his mistress, and at last became his wife, Gaunt had a further brood of children, born outside of wedlock, but afterwards made legitimate, who took a new family name and became a powerful clan in their own right, the half-blood kin of the royal house. These half-relations of Mary's children would loom large in the history of the next century, for it was from that legitimated line, in the fullness of time and through many turns of fortune, that there would eventually spring a new ruling dynasty altogether. When the tangled bloodlines of Lancaster came at last, generations later, to a new and unexpected flowering. But all of that lay far in the future. For Mary, the point was simply that she had married into the very heart of the greatest family in England, a family woven into the ruling house and reaching out by marriage across all of Europe, and that her children would be born into that dazzling and dangerous web of kinship, princes and princesses among a host of royal cousins. And we should not forget, amid all the human drama, the sheer material foundation of it all. The lands, for it was the lands that had made Mary worth fighting over to begin with, and it was the estates that her marriage carried into the House of Lancaster. Her half of the great Bohun inheritance, the earldom of Northampton, and all the manors and lordships that went with it, passed to her husband, and so to their descendants, swelling still further the already enormous Lancastrian estate. When in time her husband seized the throne, that vast inheritance, the Lancastrian estates, and the Bohun lands together, was merged into the crown itself, becoming part of the permanent endowment of the kings of England, a duchy that the sovereign holds to this very day. So Mary's inheritance did not merely enrich a noble family, it flowed, through her marriage and her husband's usurpation, into the very crown of England, and a portion of the wealth that had been gathered by the proud old dynasty of Bohun across 3 centuries became, and remains, part of the patrimony of the English crown. There is a strange permanence in that, a way in which Mary's dowry outlasted her by 600 years and more, woven now into the very fabric of the monarchy that her son and her husband wore. The woman is forgotten, her grave is lost, but the estates she carried endure quietly at the foundation of the throne. So this was Mary's life across the dozen or so years of her marriage, a life of children and households, and moving from castle to castle, of a husband forever coming and going, of prayer and fine books, and the enclosed rhythms of a high-born lady's world. She had escaped the convent. She had become a wife and a mother many times over. She stood at the heart of one of the most powerful families in the kingdom, the daughter-in-law of John of Gaunt himself, the wife of the heir to the House of Lancaster. Before we follow her story to its close, then let us pause a while longer in these middle years and look around at the wider world she lived in. For there are several things we have not yet seen that will help us to understand both the life she led and the death that was coming for her. Let us look first at the kingdom itself, at the throne and the king and the great quarrels that were even then beginning to gather, because the England of Mary's lifetime was sliding, slowly, and then less slowly, toward a storm. The king upon the throne of England, through almost all of Mary's marriage, was Richard II, and he was a strange and tragic figure. A man whose reign would end in catastrophe and would draw Mary's own family into the very centre of it. Richard had come to the throne as a boy of 10, the grandson of the old warrior king Edward III, the son of that king's eldest son, the famous Black Prince, who had died before he could inherit. So a child had been set upon the throne of a great kingdom, and around that child had clustered the ambitious uncles and leading lords who meant to rule in his name, John of Gaunt foremost among them. And the boy had grown up in the shadow of these towering men, watching them wield the power that was supposed to be his, nursing, we may imagine, a deep and growing resentment of their tutelage. As a boy he had shown real courage, riding out to face a vast rising of the common people that swept up to the very walls of London in the early years of his reign, and facing down the rebels with a coolness remarkable in one so young. But as he grew to manhood, Richard revealed a character ill-suited to the hard demands of medieval kingship, a nature that was proud, extravagant, capricious, and increasingly tyrannical. A king who came to believe in the most exalted and absolute idea of his own royal majesty, and who would brook no check upon his will. The great quarrel of his reign was the quarrel between the king and a group of the most powerful nobles in the land, lords who believed that the king was governing badly, surrounding himself with unworthy favourites, wasting the wealth of the realm, and ruling by whim rather than by law. These great lords set themselves up to curb the king, to purge his court of the men they hated, and for a time they succeeded, humbling the king and putting his friends to death in a brutal settling of accounts. And here is where Mary's own family enters the heart of the story. For the leader of these lords, the fiercest of the king's opponents, was none other than Thomas of Woodstock, the husband of Mary's sister Eleanor, the very man who had once schemed to shut Mary away in a convent. Mary's brother-in-law stood at the head of the movement to master the king, and so did another of Mary's close kin, for her own uncle on her mother's side. The Earl of Arundel, a proud and powerful and abrasive nobleman, was another of the chief among the king's enemies. Mary's family, in other words, was bound up tightly with the party that opposed and humbled King Richard, and the king did not forget it. For Richard was a man who nursed his grievances, who waited, who hid his hatred behind a smiling face, until the moment came to strike. And at last, years later, the moment came. With cunning and patience, the king turned the tables upon the powerful lords who had humbled him, and he took a terrible revenge. Mary's uncle, the Earl of Arundel, was arrested, tried before a packed assembly, condemned, and beheaded, going to his death, men said, with a steadiness that shamed his accusers. and her brother-in-law, Thomas of Woodstock, the king's own uncle, was seized and borne away to the English-held town of Calais, across the sea, and there, in secret, he was put to death, smothered or strangled in his lodging on the king's order. A prince of the blood quietly murdered to be rid of him. These were not distant strangers to her. These were her own people, her uncle and her sister's husband, destroyed by a vengeful king in the very seasons of her marriage. Though Mary may not have lived to see the very worst of it, the gathering darkness of Richard's reign was the weather of her entire adult life. The storm building over her family, even as she bore her children and kept her household and prayed over her beautiful books. And the storm, when it finally broke, would sweep her own husband to the throne. Though that lay on the far side of her grave, and its full telling belongs to a later hour of our evening. For now it is enough to know that the tyranny gathering over England in these years did not stop with the destruction of Richard's old enemies. It would reach in the end toward the House of Lancaster itself, toward Mary's own kin, and out of that final act of royal greed would come the upheaval that made her husband a king. But all of that came later. After Mary was already in her grave, she lived through the gathering of the storm. She did not live to see it break. Let us turn now from the great affairs of kings to something closer to the bone of Mary's own life, to the thing that filled so much of her short adulthood and that would, in the end, bring it to a close. Let us speak of childbirth and of what it meant to be a woman in that age, because it is the central fact of Mary's existence, and we cannot understand her without understanding it. We have seen that she bore many children across the course of her marriage, 6 who lived and perhaps 1 or more who did not, and that her childbearing began when she was still herself a child of 14. What we have not yet truly felt is how dangerous each of those births was, how every confinement was a walking toward the edge of a cliff, how the bringing of a child into the world was the most perilous thing that the women of that time regularly did. For childbirth in medieval England was a shadowed and frightening business, attended by enormous risk and a heavy toll of death. There were no doctors as we would know them present at a birth, only the women, the midwife, and the female attendants and the gossips. For it was an entirely female world, a chamber from which men were shut out altogether. When a great lady's time drew near, she went into what was called her confinement, withdrawing from the world into a darkened chamber prepared for the purpose, the windows covered, the room hung with cloths. A warm, dim, enclosed space, lit by candles, where she would remain for the birth and for some weeks after. There she would labour, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, with only the women around her and the saints to call upon. And there the great danger lay. So many things could go wrong, and the medicine of the age had almost no power to set them right. A labour that would not come, a loss of blood that could not be stopped, a fever that took hold in the days after. Any of these could carry off a young and healthy woman in a matter of hours, and there was little anyone could do but pray. Wives approaching their confinement made their wills and confessed their sins and prepared their souls for death, because they knew, every one of them, that they might not rise from the bed. It is one of the great hidden slaughters of history, this endless toll of women dying in childbed, age after age, century after century, the strong and the young along with the weak. And Mary, who walked toward that cliff edge again and again across her short years, would in the end be one of the countless thousands it claimed. And yet set against that danger, there was also the warmth and ritual and quiet female solidarity of the lying in, and we should let ourselves see that side of it too. The confinement chamber, for all its darkness and its peril, was a seat of women caring for their own, of the gathered female household tending one of their own, through the great ordeal, with all the accumulated lore and comfort and skill that the wives of the age possessed. There would be special foods and drinks prepared, soothing things, strengthening things. There would be holy relics and girdles and charms brought to aid the labour, for faith and folk belief were woven together in that society. And when the child was safely born and the mother had survived, there would in time be the ceremony of churching, the joyful return of the new mother to the church and to the world, a giving of thanks for her safe deliverance, and a marking of her passage back from the shadowed, cloistered round of the birth chamber into the light of ordinary life. Mary would have known all of this many times over, the withdrawal and the labour and the danger and again the safe return, until the one time when she did not return at all. But let us not leave her in the shadow of the birth chamber. Let us see her, instead, in one of the good seasons of her life, and let our minds rest there for a while, in the warm middle of her story. Picture a summer at Kenilworth, that most lovely of the great castles, its mighty red walls rising from the wide silver sheet of an artificial lake that had been made to surround it, so that the vast fortress seemed to float upon the water, mirrored in the still surface, ringed with reeds and the cries of water birds. Imagine Mary there in the long light of a summer evening, her household gathered about her, her children somewhere near, the older boys at their riding or their lessons in arms, the little ones with their nurses, the entire noisy, tender machinery of a young family at the height of its life. The great hall would be made ready for the evening meal, the tables set, the servants moving, the light slanting gold through the high windows and across the rushes on the floor. Out in the base court, there would be the sounds of a castle at rest, the horses, the dogs, the clink and murmur of 100 people about their evening business. And later, when the meal was done and the northern dusk came down at last, there would be music, perhaps, a harp or a lute in the chamber, and the slow settling of the great house towards sleep, the dousing of the fires, the locking of the gates, the night watch set upon the walls, and Mary in her curtained bed with the lake lying silver and still beyond the windows under the summer stars. These were the good evenings, the ones we may hope she had many of, before the last one came. And the year turned around her, as it turned around everyone in that age, in a great wheel of seasons and feasts that shaped all of life. There was the deep, enclosed dark of winter, the shortest days, the 12 days of Christmas, with their feasting and their fires and their green boughs of holly and ivy brought in to cheer the bleak season. The household drawn together against the cold. There was the slow coming of spring, the lengthening light, the holy solemnities of Lent, and the joy of Easter. There was the green fullness of summer, the season of travel and of war and of the court in its glory. And there was the gold and brown of autumn, the harvest, the slaughtering, the laying in of stores against the winter to come. Round and round the wheel turned, season after season, and Mary lived her short life within it, marking the holy days, keeping the feasts, moving with her household through the seasons and the castles. A girl whose hours were measured not by clocks and calendars, as ours are, but by the bells of the chapel and the turning of the light and the unchanging round of the Christian year. There is one more strand of Mary's world that we should gather up before we come to her ending, and that is the house she came from, on her mother's side. For if the Bohuns gave her the blood of her father, it was the line of her mother that gave her much else, and that line was nearly as mighty and quite as tangled in the fortunes of the realm. Mary's mother was a noblewoman named Joan of the House of Fitzalan, and the Fitzalans were Earls of Arundel, one of the very greatest and oldest of the noble families of England. Lords of a mighty castle on the south coast and masters of vast estates, as proud and powerful in their way as the Bohuns themselves. Through her mother, then, Mary was doubly the child of the high aristocracy, joining two of the foremost houses in the land. And through her mother, too, as we have seen, she carried that older and stranger inheritance, the blood of the Welsh princes, the line of Llywelyn the Great, passed down across the generations into the veins of an English noblewoman. So Mary stood at the meeting of three great streams, the Bohun Earls, the Fitzalan Earls, and the ancient royal blood of Wales, a confluence of some of the proudest lineage in the island. Her mother Joan was a formidable and long-lived woman, and there is a quiet sorrow in her story when set beside her daughters. For Joan outlived Mary by a quarter of a century. The mother survived the daughter by 25 years. Think on that for a moment. Joan Fitzalan lived on, growing old, through the death of her young daughter in childbed, through the rise of her son-in-law to the throne, through the early triumphs of her grandson, the mighty king, an old woman watching the entire astonishing fortune of her family unfold long after the daughter, who had been the bridge to it all, was gone. She had given Mary life, and seen her married, and seen her bear that growing brood of children, and then seen her laid in the ground at 25. And still she lived on and on into a different age, the last link to the world of Mary's girlhood. There is something piercing in the thought of that old woman, the mother who buried her child, and then lived to see that child's son conquer France, carrying within her, perhaps, the memory of a daughter that the rest of her age was already beginning to forget. And that brings us to the hardest thing about telling Mary's story at all, which is how little of her own self has come down to us. How thin and few are the traces she left behind. This is the lot of almost all women of that age, even the very greatest of them. The records of the medieval age were kept by men, and largely about men, about kings and wars and the holding of property and the making of law, and women appear in them mostly at the edges, as daughters and wives and mothers, as the bearers of inheritances and the mothers of heirs, named at their marriages and their childbeds and their deaths, and rarely much in between. We know the dates, more or less, of Mary's marriage and her children and her death. We know the bare facts of the bitter struggle over her wardship. We have her beautiful books, and the small glowing detail of the apples and pears. But of Mary herself, of her face and her voice and her thoughts and her heart, of what she loved and feared and hoped for, of how she felt about the husband she had been given, or the children she bore, or the early death that took her. Of all of that, the records are almost entirely silent. She is a shape we must reconstruct from fragments, a life we must imagine our way into across a vast gulf of silence and time. And perhaps that is part of why her story moves me, and why I wanted to bring you to her on a quiet evening like this one. Because she was a real person, as real as you or I, a girl who laughed and wept and feared and loved, who held her babies and grieved her losses and lived through all the ordinary and extraordinary days of a human life. And almost all of it is gone, swept away by the centuries, leaving only a name, a few dates, a basket of fruit, a handful of jeweled prayer books, and the towering shadow of the children she left behind. To tell her story is to try to give her back a little of the substance that time has stripped away, to remember, for the length of an evening, a woman whom the centuries have worn down to a name, a few dates, a footnote in the lives of louder men. For she was more than that, of course. Her own short life had its own shape and its own ending, and it is to that ending now that we must finally come. And so we come to it, the last summer, the ending toward which her brief existence had been quietly travelling. In the spring of that year, she had borne her fifth surviving child, a daughter, and almost at once she was carrying again, the sixth, the last. We must imagine her in those final months, a young woman, not yet 26, already the mother of a wide brood, going once more, as she had gone so many times, into the shadowed enclosed world of confinement. This time at Peterborough, in the low flat watery country of the eastern fens. It was a different landscape from the green hills of the Marches where her eldest had been born. a country of wide skies and slow rivers and endless reed-fringed marshes, of great churches rising out of the level land. There, in a castle among the fens, as the warm weather of early summer came on, she withdrew once more into the shuttered chamber, the candles lit, the windows covered, the women gathered, the dangerous labour beginning. She had walked to the edge of this particular cliff so often before, and always stepped back. She must have had little reason to fear that this confinement would be different. But this, once it was. The end came in the early summer of 1394, and it came in the way that ended so many women's lives in that age, in childbed. Mary was carrying her 7th child, her 6th to be born living, and there at Peterborough, as the warm weather came on, she was delivered of her last child, a daughter, whom they named Philippa. But she did not rise from that childbed. Whether it was the birth itself that killed her, some injury or fever or loss of blood that the medicine of the age was helpless to mend, or whether some other sickness took her in those weeks, we cannot now say, for the records are thin, and even the exact day of her death is uncertain. What is certain is the hard and simple fact of it. Mary de Bohun died at Peterborough in that early summer, having just given life to her 6th surviving child, and she was, by the best reckoning we can make, only about 25 years old. 25 years old. Pause on that for a moment, in the quiet, and let the weight of it settle. She had been married as a child of 12. She had borne her first baby at 14, and across the 11 or 12 years that followed, she had brought 6 living children into the world, one after another, until the last of them cost her her life. She had spent almost all of her short adulthood either carrying a child, or bearing one, or recovering from the bearing, and in the end, the bearing was what killed her. As it killed so many thousands of women in those centuries, the silent slaughter of childbed that ran on age after age and took the young and the strong along with the weak. She was a girl still, really by our reckoning, a young woman, barely a quarter of a century into her life, and she left behind her a husband and 6 small children, the eldest, a boy of perhaps 7, the youngest the newborn whose coming had ended her. The little ones would grow up with no memory of their mother at all, only the knowledge of her, only a name and perhaps a face in a painting. A woman who had died before they were old enough to keep her. And here is the thing that gives her passing its peculiar and aching poignancy. The thing that has drawn me to her story, and that I most want you to carry away from this evening. Mary died in 1394. And everything, all the greatness, all the glory, all the crowns and conquests that her descent would bring forth, all of it lay still in the future, on the far side of her grave. She did not live to see any of it. She never knew what was coming. When she closed her eyes for the last time in that castle in the fens, her husband was not a king, and had no prospect of being one. He was a great nobleman, the heir to Lancaster, but the throne was occupied, securely as it then seemed, by his cousin, and there was no path that anyone could see by which Henry Bolingbroke would ever wear the crown of England. She went to her grave with the towering future of her house entirely hidden from her, with no inkling of the kings and conquerors and queens that her children would become. We who look back can hardly help but feel the tragedy of it, the cruelty of a death so young, so close to so much glory, but we should remember that her own age would have understood her death rather differently than we do, and there is some comfort in that difference. To the people of the 14th century, dying was not the stranger it has become to us. It was near at every hour, familiar, expected, woven into the fabric of every life. They saw it constantly, the loss of children, the loss of mothers in childbed, the sudden sweeping ravages of the plague, and they had built around it an entire structure of faith and ritual and meaning that helped them to bear what would otherwise have been unbearable. An ending like Mary's, terrible as it was not to them a meaningless catastrophe, but a passage. The soul setting out upon its journey toward God, an event surrounded by prayer and sacrament and the sure hope of heaven. She would have died. We may trust, as the people of her faith and her age died, with the rites of the church about her, confessed and shriven and anointed, her soul commended to the mercy of God, in the firm belief that this life was but the brief antechamber to a greater and unending one. The grief of those she left behind would have been real and sharp, but it would have been a grief framed by faith, softened by the conviction that she was not lost but only gone before, that she had passed into the keeping of God and might one day be met again. There is something to be learned from that, perhaps, even by those of us who do not share the certainties of her age. For Mary, by the standards of her own world, did not die badly. She died young, which was a sorrow, but she perished having done the great work of a woman's life, having borne her children and seen them living, having been a wife and a mother and a noble lady, having lived fully, if briefly. She breathed her last in her own bed, in her own household, surrounded by her own people, with her faith to comfort her and the rites of her church to ease her passage. Many in that hard age met far worse ends than that, alone or in violence or in the horror of the plague. Mary's was, in its way, a death within the order of things, sorrowful, but not without its consolations. The passing of a woman who had lived as her world expected her to live, and who went out of it, held in the arms of her faith. We need not pretend it was not a tragedy that she died so young, but we may let ourselves be a little comforted, as her own people would have been comforted, by the thought that she did not die in despair, that she went into the dark with the light of her faith before her, believing herself bound not for nothingness, but for God, and the news went out that the Countess of Derby was dead. It must have fallen like a heavy stone upon all of that proud family and household. There were 6 small children now without a mother, the eldest a boy of 7 or 8, the youngest a newborn only days old, the very child whose coming had killed her. There was a husband, away or hurrying back, who had lost the girl he had been married to as a boy and had lived beside for more than a dozen years. The mother of all his children. There was the great machinery of a noble death to be set in motion. The washing and wrapping of the body, the candles and the watching and the prayers, the slow, solemn business by which the medieval world saw its leading ones into the ground. And there was the journey, the carrying of her body from the fenland castle where she had died to the place chosen for her rest, a funeral procession winding across the country with its torches and its black-clad mourners and its tolling bells, bearing the young countess to Leicester for burial. We know almost nothing of the private grief of those she left behind, for grief, like so much of the inner life of that age, went largely unrecorded. We do not know how her husband mourned her, what he felt, what he said. We do not know how the children took it. The older boys old enough to understand that their mother was gone, the little ones too young to grasp what they had lost. But we may be sure the grief was real, for everything we have seen of that family and that marriage speaks of genuine bonds of affection. And the loss of a young wife and mother in the fullness of her childbearing years was a heavy blow in any age. Somewhere behind the formal record of her death and burial, there were real people weeping for a real woman. A household plunged into mourning, children crying for a mother who would not come, a husband standing by a grave. That much we can be certain of, even across the silence of 600 years. They buried her in Leicester, in a fine church of the House of Lancaster. And the very story of her grave is a small, sorrowful epilogue all its own. She was laid to rest in a collegiate church in a part of the town called the Newark, a religious foundation built and endowed by the Earls and Dukes of Lancaster, a fitting place for the wife of the heir to that house, a place of chantries and priests, and the daily singing of masses for the souls of the dead. There she was laid, the Countess, in the family's own holy place, with prayers said over her, and in due course a tomb raised above her by the husband and son who survived her. And had things stayed as they were, her grave might have become a shrine of honour and remembrance, the tended tomb of the mother of a famous king, visited and remembered down the centuries. But things did not stay as they were. For more than 100 years after her death, in the vast upheaval of religion that swept through England in a later age, that world of chantries and collegiate churches and prayers for the dead was torn down and swept away. And the church in the Newark where Mary lay was among the casualties, dissolved and demolished, its stones taken off, its tombs lost. And so the grave of Mary de Bohun, the mother of Henry V, was effaced and forgotten, until today even the experts argue over exactly where her bones came to rest, and there is no tomb to visit, no monument to stand before. Only the uncertain memory of a lost church in a Midland town. The woman who gave the House of Lancaster its greatest king has in the end no marked grave at all. But while Mary slept in her grave at Leicester, the age she had left went on turning, and within just a few short years it turned in a way that would have astonished her beyond all reckoning. For 5 years after her death, in 1399, the unimaginable happened. Her husband, Henry Bolingbroke, the restless crusader, the man who had sent her apples and pears, reached out and took the crown of England for himself. The cousin who had held the throne, King Richard II, had grown into a capricious and tyrannical ruler, and had at last made the fatal error of seizing the vast Lancastrian inheritance when old John of Gaunt died, disinheriting Henry and driving him into exile. But Henry came back with an army and a grievance, and the wide support of a kingdom weary of Richard's misrule, and in a swift and stunning campaign he swept Richard from power, took him prisoner, and mounted the throne himself as King Henry IV, the first king of the House of Lancaster. The man Mary had married as a boy of 14, the husband she had waited for through all his wanderings, was now the anointed King of England. And so we arrive at the cruel and tender irony that sits at the very centre of Mary's story. Had she lived just 5 years more, had she not died in that childbed at Peterborough in the summer of 1394, Mary de Bohun would have been crowned Queen of England. She would have been the first Lancastrian queen, the consort of King Henry IV, the mother of the heir to the throne. The girl who had been marked out for a convent, who had so nearly been shut away from the world entirely, would have risen instead to the very summit of it, to a crown and a throne and a queen's estate. But she missed it by 5 years. She died a countess and was buried a countess. And the crown that her own life and her own children had helped to bring within her husband's reach was set upon another woman's head. For Henry, as king, would marry again a foreign princess, who would be the Queen Mary never lived to be. There is something almost unbearably poignant in it, in a life that did all the work and was gone before the reward, that carried the House of Lancaster to the very doorstep of glory, and then slipped away into the dark before the door was opened. And there is a further, sharper twist to drive the irony home, for we know exactly who did wear the crown that might have been Mary's. Some years into his reign, the widowed King Henry took a second wife, a foreign princess, the widow of a great continental duke, a woman of mature age and considerable spirit named Joan, who came from the small kingdom of Navarre in the mountains between Spain and France. She crossed the sea to England, and she was crowned with all ceremony as Queen of England, and she took the place at the king's side that Mary had not lived to fill, the place of Queen Consort, mistress of the royal household. First Lady of the realm, she brought the king no children, for all of his were Mary's, but she was queen in every sense that she never was, anointed and crowned and seated upon a throne. And her own later story was a strange and troubled one, for after the old king died and his famous son reigned, this stepmother queen fell under a dark accusation, charged with the dreadful and shadowy crime of witchcraft, of seeking the king's death by sorcery, and she was stripped of her wealth and held in confinement for years, before being quietly released and restored at the very end. So the woman who wore Mary's crown found that the crown brought its own sorrows, accusation and imprisonment and disgrace. And one wonders, idly, across the centuries, whether Mary, had she lived to be queen, would have fared any better or worse. We cannot know. We know only that the throne Mary missed was filled by another, that the title she never bore was borne by a stranger, and that the girl who had done so much to bring the House of Lancaster to the crown lay all the while in her grave at Leicester, a countess to the end, while another woman was called Queen of England in her place. For the true measure of Mary de Bohun is not to be found in her own short life at all, brief and quiet and largely undocumented as it was. It is to be found in what came after her, in the astonishing destinies of the 6 children she left behind. For from that one young woman, dead at 25, there sprang an entire generation of kings and dukes and queens who would shape the history of England and of Europe for half a century to come. Let us follow them now, her children, out into the wide world she did not live to see, and feel through them the magnitude of what her short years had set in motion. Her eldest, of course, was that boy born at Monmouth, who grew up to become King Henry V of England, and there is no figure in all of English history who burns more brightly in the national memory. When his father died, worn out and ill, after a troubled reign of less than 14 years, the crown passed to this son of Mary's, and he proved to be a soldier and a leader of a kind that comes perhaps once in many centuries. He revived the old English claim to the throne of France, and he led an army across the Channel to make that claim good. And on a muddy field in the autumn rain, against all the odds, and against a French host many times the size of his own exhausted and outnumbered force, he won the most famous victory in the history of English arms. The field was called Agincourt, and the name has rung down the centuries ever since as a byword for courage against impossible odds, for the triumph of the few over the many. Mary's son stood at the head of his men that day and led them to a victory so complete and so astonishing that it seemed to his own age very nearly a miracle, a sign of God's favour upon him and upon England. And he did not stop there. In the years that followed, Henry V went on to conquer vast swathes of France outright, taking city after city, province after province, until he had brought the French crown itself to the bargaining table. By a famous treaty, he was recognised as the heir to the throne of France, and he married the daughter of the French king, and it seemed, for one dizzying moment, that he would unite the 2 ancient enemy kingdoms of England and France under a single crown, his own, and found an empire that would dominate all of Western Europe. It was the high noon of English power in the medieval age, and it was all the work of the boy born in that border castle to a girl of 18. Mary's son had become the greatest warrior king of his age. And yet he too would die young, struck down by sickness in the midst of his triumph before he could wear the double crown he had won, leaving behind an infant son and an empire that would not long outlive him. But that is another story, for another night. What matters here is simply this, that the most celebrated king England ever raised was the child of Mary de Bohun, carried in her body, born in her chamber at Monmouth, and that she never lived to see a single day of his glory. Let us linger over that son a little longer, for there is more to him than the glory, and the man he became is the great monument to the mother who made him and lost him. He was about 7 or 8 years old when she was gone, old enough, perhaps, to carry some dim memory of her, a face, a voice, a presence in his earliest years, though he can have kept little of her into his manhood. He grew up motherless in the care of others, while his father climbed toward the throne, and his boyhood was shaped by the vast upheavals of those years, by his father's exile and return and seizure of the crown, by the wars in Wales where the young prince won his first hard experience of battle, fighting against the Great Welsh Rising while still little more than a boy and bearing the scars of it. There grew up around his youth, in later memory, a legend of wildness, a tale of a riotous and dissolute young prince who caroused and ran wild in his father's last days before being transformed, upon his accession to the throne, into a sober and majestic king, casting off his old companions and his old ways and putting on the gravity of kingship like a robe. How much of that legend is true and how much is the embroidery of later storytellers, we cannot now say, but there is at least this much in it: that the young man who became king proved to be a ruler of extraordinary seriousness and discipline and force of will, a man utterly dedicated to his crown and his cause, austere, devout, relentless, and brilliant, and his reign, for all its brevity, blazed like a comet across the sky of his age. In the few short years that were given him, he transformed the fortunes of his kingdom, healed the divisions that had troubled his father's troubled reign, united the quarrelsome nobility behind him, and led them to glory in France. He was, by all accounts, a leader who inspired an almost mystical devotion in his men, a king who shared their hardships, who led from the front, who bound an army to him by the sheer force of his presence and his purpose. He believed, with a fierce and total conviction, that God was on his side, that his cause was just and his victories the sign of divine favour. And that conviction carried him and his men through dangers and against odds that should by every reckoning have destroyed them. He was not a gentle man, nor an easy one, and his wars brought much suffering, as all wars do, and there were dark and cruel moments in his campaigns that the glory should not be allowed to hide. But he was, beyond any argument, one of the greatest soldiers and one of the most formidable kings that England ever produced, and he came within a hair's breadth of achieving the impossible, the joining of the crowns of England and France upon his own head. And then, at the very summit of his triumph, with the double crown almost in his grasp, he was struck down, not by an enemy's sword, but by sickness, by some camp fever or flux contracted in the field, and he died, far from home. Still a youth, not yet in his middle 30s. He left behind him a son who was a baby less than a year old, and a vast inheritance of conquest that no infant could hope to hold, and within a generation it was all undone. All lost, the glittering edifice of his greatness crumbling away in the weak hands of his unworthy successor. So even the most glorious of Mary's children, the brightest star she brought into the world, burned out young and left ruin behind him, dead before his time as his mother had been, as so many of that family seemed fated to be. There is a terrible pattern in it, this early death running through the House of Lancaster, the mother dead at 25, the mighty son dead in his 30s, the line guttering out in tragedy. Mary began it all, and Mary, mercifully, saw none of it. Nor was Henry the only one of her sons to climb to greatness. For all four of those boys grew into men of the first importance in the kingdom. The second son, Thomas, who was made Duke of Clarence, became a bold and ardent soldier in his brother's wars, fighting at the forefront of the campaigns in France, until he was killed in battle there, cut down in a reckless charge against the French, dying as headlong as he had lived. The third son, John, who was made Duke of Bedford, proved to be perhaps the ablest of them all, a wise and steady and formidable man, and after his brother, the great king died. It was John who took up the enormous task of holding the conquered lands of France together and governing them in the name of his infant nephew. ruling as regent over a war-torn kingdom for many hard years with a skill and a patience that won the respect even of his enemies. And the youngest, Humphrey, who was made Duke of Gloucester, became one of the most glittering and difficult figures of the age. A man of learning and culture and great ambition, a patron of scholars and a collector of books, but also a quarrelsome and grasping politician whose feuds would trouble the kingdom for decades. 4 sons then, and every one of them a duke, and among them a king who conquered France, and a regent who ruled it. From the womb of a woman dead at 25 came the men who led England through one of the most dramatic chapters of its entire history. And there is a deeper poignancy in the story of those 4 brothers than the mere catalogue of their greatness can convey, for they were in the early days a band of brothers in the truest sense. 4 boys who had lost their mother, young and grown up close, bound together by blood and by the great enterprise of their family's rise, and they stood by one another, for a time, with a real and moving loyalty. When the eldest became king and carried the war into France, his brothers were his right hands, his most trusted captains and counsellors, and the conquest was in a real sense a family enterprise. The sons of Mary de Bohun, making war together upon a kingdom. Thomas of Clarence was his brother's heir for years, until the warrior king at last had a son of his own, and Thomas fought and at last died in that war. Killed in a rash and gallant charge, the first of the brothers to fall, mourned by the others. John of Bedford gave the best years of his life and all of his great abilities to holding together, after the king's death, the impossible inheritance of conquered France, wearing himself out in the long thankless struggle to preserve his dead brother's achievement for a nephew who would lose it all, dying at last in France, far from home, worn down by the weight he had carried. And Humphrey of Gloucester, the youngest, the brilliant difficult one, lived on the longest of the 4, scheming and quarrelling and patronising scholars and stirring up trouble, until he too came at last to a dark and lonely end. Arrested by his enemies and dying in custody in circumstances that many thought were murder, the last of Mary's sons to be swallowed by the violent politics of the age. 4 brothers then, who rose together and fell one by one, and not one of whom died quietly in his bed, full of years. They were the children of a woman who had herself perished young, and they too, for the most part, met early or violent or sorrowful ends, as though some shadow lay upon the entire brilliant doomed family. And her 2 daughters, the little girls she had named Blanche and Philippa, the second of whom had cost her her life, these 2 rose to heights that their mother could never have dreamed. For in that age, the daughters of kings and princes were sent out to marry into the ruling houses of the continent, to seal alliances and bind kingdoms together, and Mary's girls, as the sisters of the King of England, were prizes of the very highest value, carried off to thrones and courts far beyond the sea. Both of them would leave the land of their birth behind them, never, so far as we know, to see it again. And one of them would climb, before the end, higher even than her mother had ever stood. There is a strange and circling sorrow in the thought of it, that the woman who bore these 2 girls, and gave her own life in the bearing of the younger, never lived to see either of them grow into the queens and princesses of Europe that they became. Let us follow them out then, into the wide world that she herself never saw. Let us follow those 2 girls a little further out into the wider world, for their stories deserve more than a passing line, and they tell us something about the strange fate of royal daughters in that age. Blanche, the elder, was sent away to Germany while she was still hardly more than a child, married into one of the greatest princely houses of the Holy Roman Empire, a girl of England carried off across the sea to a strange land, a strange court, a strange tongue, to be the wife of a foreign prince she had likely never met. It was the common lot of such daughters to be sent far from home in childhood, to seal some alliance of state, to become strangers in distant courts, to bear children to foreign dynasties, and often to die young and far away, as Blanche did, perishing in the German lands while still a girl, her short life spent in the service of a marriage made for reasons of policy before she was old enough to understand them. She lies somewhere in Germany, this daughter of Mary de Bohun, another young woman of that family dead, too young in a foreign country, and few in England now remember that there ever was such a person. But Philippa, the youngest, the baby whose birth had cost Mary her life, lived to climb higher than any of them, and her story has a strange grandeur to it. She was married, while still little more than a girl, to the king who ruled the vast northern realms of Scandinavia, the lands of Denmark and Norway and Sweden, which in that age had been joined together into a single mighty union under one crown, a northern empire stretching up to the very edge of the frozen north. And so this English girl, born in a fenland castle, became the queen of all the north, mistress of those cold and mighty kingdoms, reigning far away among the fjords and the snows and the winter darkness of the northern lands. She proved, by the accounts that survive, a capable and respected queen, trusted by her husband, active in the governance of her realms, even taking a hand in their defence in time of danger. She lived out her life there in the north, a long way from the England she had left as a child, and perished at last in those distant realms, the daughter of a forgotten mother grown into a queen over 3 kingdoms. It is a remarkable arc, from the birth chamber that killed her mother to a throne at the top of the age, and it is the strangest and most far-flung branch of all the destinies that grew out of Mary's short life. The infant who never knew her mother became a queen, while the mother herself had been only ever a countess, dead before any crown came near her house. The wheel of fortune turns in strange ways, and it turned, for the children of Mary de Bohun, very high indeed. So look, now, at what this one short life had brought forth. From Mary de Bohun, dead before she was 30, came a king who conquered France. 3 dukes who led armies and ruled provinces and shaped the politics of a kingdom, and 2 daughters who married into the royal houses of Germany and the North. One of them a queen over 3 realms. Her blood ran into the thrones of half of Europe. The brilliant, violent, glorious generation of the House of Lancaster, at its very zenith, the generation of Agincourt and the conquest of France, was her generation, her children, the issue of her body. She was the source of it, the spring from which all that greatness flowed, and she knew none of it. She did the work, the patient, dangerous work of bearing and beginning all those remarkable lives, and then she was gone, slipped quietly out of the world before any of them had grown, before any of the glory had begun. A young woman in a fenland castle who could not have guessed that she was the mother of an age. It is worth lingering, too, on the man she left behind, the husband who went on without her to become a king, because his later story casts its own light back upon hers. Henry Bolingbroke grieved, so far as we can tell, for the young wife who had died in the fenland castle. He did not rush to marry again. Years went by, and through the great upheaval that carried him to the throne, he remained a widower, and it was only some years into his reign as king that he at last took a second wife, a foreign princess, a widowed duchess from across the sea, in a match made for reasons of state. That marriage gave him no more children. All of his children, the entire brood that would shape the age, were Mary's, born in those crowded years of their early life together. Whatever was in his heart, the plain shape of the record suggests a man who had loved, in his fashion, the girl he had married as a boy, and who did not hurry to replace her. It is one of the quiet kindnesses we can do Mary's memory to notice that, in an age when powerful men remarried quickly and as a matter of course, when a widowed lord with lands to pass on and a household to run would often take a new wife within months of burying the old. Mary's husband waited long. He rose to the throne, a widower, and reigned a widower for a long while before at last, for reasons of policy, as much as anything, he married again. We should not make too much of it, for we cannot see into his heart across 6 centuries. And there were practical reasons enough for a man so beset by the troubles of a stolen crown to put off the business of remarriage. But the simple fact remains that he did not hurry, that the girl who had borne him all his children and shared the span of his rising was not quickly forgotten or quickly replaced, and that when at last he did take a new wife, it was a marriage that gave him nothing more. No children, no new line, only a queen to stand beside him in his troubled latter days. Mary had been the wife of his youth, the mother of his house, the companion of the years before the crown, and whatever the truth of his feelings, the shape of his life after her death speaks, however faintly, of a loss that was real. She was mourned, this forgotten woman, by the man who became a king. That much, at least, we may believe. But the crown that Henry seized brought him little joy in the wearing of it, and his reign as king was a long, unhappy struggle against the consequences of the way he had taken power. For he had done a terrible and unprecedented thing. He had deposed and destroyed an anointed king, his own cousin, the man God's own ordinance had set upon the throne, and that deed hung over him for the rest of his life like a curse. The deposed king did not long survive his fall. Dying in captivity in a northern castle, in circumstances that no one believed were natural, and the shadow of that death lay across Henry's reign forever after. He was never secure. Rebellion after rebellion rose against him, in the north, in Wales, among the very lords who had helped him to power. The Welsh rose under a leader of their own and waged a long, fierce war of independence that consumed years of Henry's reign. His health, once so robust, broke down, and in his later years he was afflicted by a wasting and disfiguring illness that some whispered was a judgment upon him for the blood he had shed. He grew old before his time, careworn and ailing and haunted, and he died at last. Not yet an old man, worn out by the weight of the crown he had taken, having reigned for less than 14 troubled years. The throne that Mary never lived to share had brought her husband more sorrow than glory. And then there is her sister, Eleanor, the elder Bohun girl, whose life ran alongside Mary's like a darker echo, and whose own fate we should not leave untold. For the 2 sisters and their 2 destinies make a strange and sorrowful pair. You will remember that Eleanor had made the grander marriage of the 2, wedding Thomas of Woodstock, the king's own uncle, the prince of the blood who had schemed to make little Mary a nun and steal her share of the inheritance. For a time Eleanor stood far higher than her younger sister, a duchess married to one of the mightiest men in the realm. But that very height proved her family's undoing. For Thomas of Woodstock was a proud and turbulent and dangerous man, and he set himself against the young King Richard, becoming the leader of those mighty lords who sought to curb the king's power and rule him, and Richard never forgave it. In time the king had his revenge, and Thomas of Woodstock was destroyed, made away with in secret across the sea, in the manner we have already heard. Eleanor was left a widow in the most terrible circumstances, her husband destroyed by the crown, her family cast down, and there is a bitter irony in what became of her then. For the woman whose husband had tried to shut Mary away in a convent ended her own days in religious retreat, broken by grief, dying not long after, in the very year that her age turned and her brother-in-law seized the throne. The 2 Bohun sisters, who between them had inherited one of the greatest fortunes in England, both came to early and sorrowful ends, the one dead in childbed at 25, the other dead of grief in the wreck of her husband's ambition. And the great inheritance they had carried flowed on into the House of Lancaster and the crown of England, while the two women who had borne it slipped away into early graves. What, then, became of the house that her children built? That brilliant Lancastrian generation of kings and dukes and queens. It is worth following the thread a little further to its end, because there is a sorrow in that too, a sorrow that Mary was spared by dying when she did. The glory of her son Henry V proved to be a high and dazzling noon that gave way with terrible speed to a long and ruinous afternoon. For the mighty king died early, in the midst of his conquests, leaving the double crown of England and France to a son who was a baby less than a year old, a child who could not rule. And that child, Mary's grandson, grew into a gentle, holy, hopeless king, utterly unfit for the violent throne he had inherited, and under his feeble hand, everything his father had won was lost. The conquests in France were bled away, bit by bit, until nothing remained. And then, far worse, the great nobles of England, with no strong king to master them, fell to quarrelling among themselves, and at last to open war. A savage civil conflict between two branches of the royal house that history would come to call the Wars of the Roses. In that war, Mary's descendants tore each other to pieces. Her grandson, the gentle king, was deposed and imprisoned and at last murdered. His only son was killed in battle. The House of Lancaster, the dynasty that her marriage and her children had raised to such glittering heights, was hunted down and very nearly destroyed, until the direct male line of it was utterly extinguished, and the crown passed away to other hands. Mary did not live to see her son's glory, but neither did she live to see the ruin that followed it. The slow, terrible unmaking of everything her children had built. She was spared all of it, the triumph and the catastrophe alike, sleeping in her lost grave in Leicester, while the storm she had unknowingly helped to seed gathered and broke over the heads of her descendants. There is a kind of mercy in that, perhaps, in having been taken out of the world before either the glory or the grief arrived. Mary lived in the quiet years, the years before the house's great rise and its greater fall, the seasons of children and castles, and a husband who was only a nobleman, not yet a king and not yet an usurper, haunted by his crime. She knew her children only as children, the boys at their lessons and their play, the babies at her breast, none of them yet a conqueror or a regent or a murdered king, none of them yet anything but her own small sons and daughters in the firelight of a winter's evening. Whatever sorrows her brief existence held, and it held its share, the bearing of too many children, too young, the long absences of her wandering husband, the early loss of an infant, the constant moving from house to house. She was spared the deep sorrows that came after, and she kept, to the end, the simple, ordinary world of a mother and her young family before history reached out and swept them all up into its terrible machinery. And yet before we let her rest, there are a few more things worth saying, a few more threads to follow out from that short life, for the influence of Mary de Bohun did not end with her own children. Remarkable as they were, it ran on, through the generations, into the royal houses of half of Europe, in a way that she could never have imagined. For her blood, once it had entered the bloodstream of kings, spread out through the centuries as such blood does, through marriages and alliances and the endless intermarrying of the royal families of the continent. Her son, the famous king, left a line that, though it ended in disaster in England, had carried his descent for a time. Her daughters, married into Germany in the north, carried her lineage into the heart of European royalty, into the lines of emperors and northern kings. And down through the centuries that followed, as the royal dynasties of Europe married and remarried among themselves, the descent of this one short-lived English noblewoman threaded its way into one princely line after another, until in time there can have been few crowned heads in the western lands who did not carry, somewhere in the vast tangled tree of their ancestry, a strand that ran back to the girl who perished at Peterborough in the summer of 1394. It is one of the strange, quiet truths of history, the way the blood of a single, obscure life can spread and spread until it touches everything, the way a woman almost forgotten can stand, all unknowing, at the head of a river of descent that waters a continent. And there is a smaller, more intimate thread of remembrance too, one that I find more moving than all the grand genealogies, and it has to do with a swan. You will remember that the ancient House of Bohun bore as its emblem a white swan, a proud and beautiful device carried by Mary's family down the centuries. When Mary married into the House of Lancaster and bore her children, that swan passed to them, a small inheritance from their lost mother, and her sons bore it among their own heraldic badges. Her mighty warrior son, the king who conquered France, used the white swan of the Bohuns among his devices, wore it, displayed it, claimed it as part of who he was. And so, on the banners and the badges of the most famous king of his age, on the field of his greatest victories, there flew the swan of his mother's family, the emblem of the woman who had died when he was a small boy. The only inheritance, perhaps, that he truly carried from her, a white bird gleaming on the standards of a conqueror. It is a tiny thing, a heraldic device, and yet there is something tender in it. The thought that the son, who never really knew his mother, carried her family's swan into battle. That some thread of her ran on in the very symbols of his greatness. That she was present in that small, silent way on the fields where her son made history. Mary belongs, in the end, to a particular and poignant company. The company of those who stood on the very threshold of greatness and were taken before they could cross it. The almost queens, the might-have-beens of history. There have been others like her down the centuries, women and men who died just short of the crown or the triumph that their lives had been building toward, who did all the work and missed the reward, who were taken off by sickness or accident or childbed in the last years or months or even days before the great change came. There is always something especially affecting about such stories, about the cruelty of timing, about how very nearly things might have gone otherwise. Had Mary lived 5 more years, she would have been a queen, and her story would be told quite differently, as the tale of the first Lancastrian queen, the mother of the conqueror, a famed and celebrated figure. Instead, she is a footnote, a name in the genealogies, the wife who died too soon, remembered, when she is remembered at all, only as the mother of a more famous son. The 5 years she missed made all the difference in how history would remember her. And there is a lesson in that, perhaps, about how much of fame and obscurity is simply a matter of timing, of living long enough to be there when the crown comes, or of slipping away in the dark just before it does. There is a particular sorrow in the matter of her lost grave that is worth dwelling on a little longer, because it touches something deep in the medieval understanding of death and memory, something we have largely lost ourselves. To the people of Mary's age, the remembrance of the dead was not a sentimental matter, but a sacred duty and a practical necessity, woven into the very fabric of their faith. They believed that the souls of the departed passed into a long purifying suffering before they could come at last to heaven, and that the prayers of the living could ease and shorten that suffering, could reach across the veil and help the dead toward their rest. And so the rich and powerful of that age poured out enormous sums to ensure that they would be prayed for after their deaths, founding chantries, endowing priests, paying for masses to be sung for their souls in perpetuity, building themselves fine tombs in churches where their names and their images would keep their memory alive and call the living to pray for them. To be remembered, to be prayed for, to have your name spoken and your soul commended to God year after your death, this was not vanity. It was to the medieval mind a matter of the soul's salvation, a lifeline reaching out of the grave. This is what makes the loss of her resting place so much more than a mere matter of stone and bone. In that age, to be buried in such a foundation was to be caught up in an unending machinery of remembrance. One's soul prayed for, and one's name spoken, and one's rest eased, season upon season, by the ceaseless devotions of the living. That was the provision the wealthy made against the terrors of the life to come, and Mary, laid among the dead of her husband's kin, would have had it in full measure. And then, in the sweeping change of religion that came upon England more than 100 years after her passing, the whole of that machinery was dismantled. The belief that had raised it was cast aside, the endowments seized, the prayers for the dead forbidden, and with them went the very reason such places had ever stood. What was taken from Mary then was not merely a monument, but the entire apparatus of memory that had been built to hold her back from oblivion, so that she slipped, in the end, into precisely the forgetting that all those devotions had been meant to prevent. The provision failed, the remembrance ceased, and she passed into the silence from which we are, for this one evening, briefly calling her back. And that silence is the silence that lies over so many of the women of the past, which is the last thing I want us to think about tonight before we draw towards sleep. For Mary is far from alone in having been forgotten, in having left so faint a trace, in being remembered only as the appendage of more famous men. The entire long history of the age is full of such women, women who lived and loved and laboured and bore the children, who became the kings and the conquerors and the mighty men, whose names fill the histories, while they themselves slipped away almost unrecorded, their inner lives unwritten, their own stories untold. For every famous man whose deeds are chronicled in detail, there is a mother who bore him, who shaped his earliest years, who is given a line or two in the records, and then forgotten. Mary was such a woman. She gave the world one of its most celebrated kings, and a generation of princes and queens besides, and her reward, across the centuries, has been to be a footnote in their stories, a name attached to theirs. The woman who happened to be the mother of Henry V. To spend an evening with her, to give her her own story for once, to make her the centre rather than the margin, is a small act of remembrance. A way of saying that her life mattered in itself, and not only for what it produced, that she was a person and not merely a link in a chain of greater persons. Because she was a person. That is what I keep coming back to, in the quiet, when I think about Mary de Bohun. Behind the dates and the genealogies and the grand dynastic story, there was a girl, a real girl, who was taken from her home as a child and married to a boy she did not know, who bore her first baby when she was barely more than a baby herself, who spent her short years moving from cold castle to cold castle, bearing child after child, waiting through the absences of a husband who roamed her age while she kept the hearth. There was a young woman who prayed over jewelled books in the candlelight, who must have laughed sometimes and wept sometimes and feared the next confinement and loved her children and felt the seasons turn, who had a face and a voice and a heart that we will never know. And there was a death, an ordinary, terrible, early death, in a fenland castle in the early summer. A new mother of 25 slipping away with her newest baby in the world, and 5 more children who would grow up barely remembering her. That is the human truth at the centre of all the grandeur, and it is that truth, more than all the kings and conquests, that I wanted to bring you tonight. So let us draw it all together now, gently, as our evening draws toward its close, and let us see the entire shape of this life laid out from beginning to end. She came into the age the younger daughter of an ancient and storied house, and was orphaned of her father almost before she could remember him, and became, while still a small child, one of the 2 richest little girls in England, a prize over which the mightiest men in the land would scheme and struggle. She was nearly shut away in a convent and buried alive in religion for the sake of an inheritance, and was rescued from that fate at the last moment, only to be married off as a child of 12 to a boy she did not know, to settle a quarrel between princes. She grew, in that arranged and bargained marriage, into a wife and a mother, and bore child after child across a dozen close-spaced years, 6 who lived, while her husband roamed the world and she kept the hearth. She prayed over beautiful books and ran noble households and moved from castle to castle through the turning seasons of a hard and dangerous age. And then, still young, still in the fullness of her childbearing, she perished, as so many did, in bringing a new life into the world, and was laid in a grave that the centuries would efface, and was very nearly forgotten. That is all of it. The arc of an existence of perhaps 25 years, lived 600 years ago, mostly in silence, mostly unrecorded, an ordinary noblewoman's life of marriage and children, and early death. And yet out of that short and quiet and largely forgotten life, there came an age. That is the wonder of it. The thing that makes Mary worth remembering when so many like her are lost. We have already followed her children out into their destinies. The son who became the most celebrated of English kings, the brothers who fought and ruled at his side, the daughters carried off to thrones beyond the sea. All of it, the whole dazzling and doomed brilliance of Lancaster at its height, had its origin in this one young woman. She was in the most literal sense the mother of an age, and she never knew it, never saw a day of it, was gone before any of it began. There is a kind of grandeur in that, a quiet, hidden grandeur, the splendour of the source that gives rise to the river and is itself forgotten, of the root that feeds the vast tree and lies unseen beneath the earth. It makes you think about how much of history is made this way, in the dark, by people who never see what they have set in motion. We tell the story of the past as the story of leading men and their great deeds, the kings and the conquerors and the battles and the crowns, and we forget how every one of those great men came into the world the same way. Carried in a woman's body, born in a woman's pain, shaped in his earliest years by a mother who is given, in the histories, a line or two and then forgotten. Behind every famous king there is a forgotten mother. Behind the conqueror of France there was a girl who died at 25 in a fenland castle and was buried in a church that no longer stands. The visible history of the age rests upon a vast invisible foundation of such lives, the lives of the mothers who bore and began the men whose names we remember, and Mary de Bohun is one of the countless many who built that foundation and were then forgotten upon it. To remember her, even for one evening, even a little, is to remember all of them, the hidden mothers of history, the forgotten authors of remembered greatness. And so, at the very last, let us simply let her rest. Let us leave her where she lies, somewhere beneath the streets of a Midland town, in the lost foundations of a vanished church, in a grave no one can any longer find. She has lain there now for more than 600 years, through all the long centuries that followed her, through the rise and the fall of her own noble house, through the wars and the upheavals and the slow turning of the ages, sleeping the sleep, untroubled, at peace. The glory and the grief alike are over now, the conquests and the catastrophes, the crowns won and lost. All of it long since passed away into the silence of history, and she sleeps on through all of it. The young mother who began so much and saw so little, at rest at last after her short and crowded life. There is a peace in that thought, I find, a deep, quiet peace. The peace of a life completed and a long rest earned, of all the striving and the sorrow finally and forever laid down. She did her work, this woman, the hard and patient and dangerous work of her brief existence, and then she laid it down and now she sleeps. and the river she set flowing has run on without her for 600 years and more. There is one last way that we can reach through the centuries and almost touch her, and I want to leave you with it, because it is the nearest thing to a living trace of Mary that remains in the world. Her grave is lost, her tomb is gone, no portrait of her face survives. No words of her own have come down to us, but her books endure. Some of those beautiful illuminated prayer books that were made for her and her family have survived all the centuries, kept safe in great libraries, and they are still there today. Their colours still glowing, their gold still bright, the same pages that she herself once turned by candlelight as she said her prayers. Think of that for a moment. The very objects she held in her hands, the very images she gazed upon in her hours of devotion, the painted saints and the flowering borders, and the little figures in the margins that her own eyes once rested upon, these things still exist, have outlasted her by 600 years and more, are kept and treasured and studied still. To turn those pages now, as scholars sometimes do, is to look upon exactly what Mary looked upon, to share, across the wide gulf of time, one small intimate experience with a woman dead for 6 centuries. The books are the bridge. Through them, faint and partial as it is, we can reach back and find her, the devout young woman at her prayers, and know that she was real, that she lived, that she held these same bright pages in her hands in the flickering light of a 14th century evening, much as you are holding the thread of her story now, in the quiet of your own night. And that, perhaps, is the deepest reason to spend an evening like this one in the company of someone so long gone. For the past is not really another country, sealed off and separate from us. It is the same country, only earlier, peopled by men and women who were as real as we are, who felt the cold and the warmth, who loved their children and feared their deaths, who lay down at night as you are lying now, and let the day go, and drifted towards sleep under the same stars that wheel above you tonight. Mary de Bohun lay down to sleep, more than 600 years ago, in castle after castle across the length of England. A girl with a house full of children and a wandering husband and a heart full of all the hopes and fears that fill a human heart. And now she sleeps the longer sleep, and we tonight have kept her company for a while, have called her back out of the silence and given her, for the space of an evening, her own story told for her own sake. That is a small and quiet kind of kindness, the kindness of remembrance, and it is one of the few gifts we can still give to the long dead, simply to think of them, to speak their names, to hold their lives in our minds for a little while, before we too let go and sleep. So let her settle now, in your thoughts, as you yourself begin to settle. The young countess in her candlelit chamber, with her beautiful books and her many children and her absent, adventuring husband. The girl who escaped the convent and married a king-to-be and became the mother of a conqueror. The woman who did so much and saw so little, who carried a mighty house to the very threshold of its glory, and then slipped quietly away into the dark before the door was opened. She has been at rest for a very long time now. All her striving and her sorrow long since laid down, and there is nothing left to fear for her or to grieve for her, only a life to be remembered, and then, gently, released. Let the castles fade now, and the candlelight, and the roads of medieval England, and the white swan on the banners, and the lost grave beneath the midland town. Let it all grow dim and soft and distant, the way the day grows distant as you sink towards sleep. The story is told, the remembering is done, and she, and you, and all of us, may rest. Before I leave you to your sleep, let me say one last quiet thing, as I promised I would, and then I will trouble you no further tonight. If the hours we have spent together this evening have been good company, If you would like to find your way back to more of these long, slow journeys into the past on the nights when sleep is slow in coming, then you would be most welcome to stay close, so that the next of these evenings can come and find you when it is ready. There is no hurry and no pressure in it, only an open door, there whenever you should wish to come through it again. It is a quiet joy to me to think of you out there, settling down to rest, and to know that these old stories can be of some small use in carrying you gently towards sleep. That is all I wanted to say, and now there is nothing left to do but to let go. So let the lamp burn low, let your breathing slow and deepen, let the day and the long centuries and the entire turning world drift away into the soft and gathering dark. Mary de Bohun is at rest, and has been these 600 years, and now it is your turn to rest as well. There is nothing more you need to do tonight, nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to carry. You can set it all down now, just as she set it all down once, in ages past, and let yourself sink, slowly and gently and without effort, down and down, into the quiet, into the warm, into the deep, untroubled sleep that is waiting for you now. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.